Dr. Foster's gloved hands froze mid-incision, the scalpel trembling above Eleanor Reynolds' exposed back. "My God," she whispered, 30 years of surgical experience offering no explanation for what lay beneath the 60-year-old woman's weathered skin. The routine removal of what should have been a simple lipoma had revealed something impossible, metal gleaming under the harsh operating room lights. The scrub nurse beside her stepped back involuntarily, hand rising to cover her mask as the monitoring equipment beeped in steady contrast to the human stillness. "Someone get Dr. Harrison in here now," Dr. Foster ordered, her voice unnaturally steady despite her widened eyes. Jessica Reynolds watched through the observation window, fingers pressed against the glass that separated her from her mother, remembering how she'd begged Eleanor for years to have the bump examined. "We need to document everything before proceeding, Doctor," Foster commanded, though her mind screamed that what she was seeing should be impossible. What secrets had Eleanor Reynolds carried within her body for 3 decades? And what would happen when they were finally exposed to the light? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor Reynolds had grown accustomed to being invisible. At 60, with silver hair cropped short for practicality rather than style, she moved through the world like a ghost, present but rarely seen. Her small ranch house on the outskirts of Springfield, Massachusetts, sat half empty, filled with Catherine's things she couldn't bear to move even a decade after her wife's passing. The mantel displayed photos chronicling a life well lived. Eleanor in her crisp military nurse's uniform during the Gulf War, Catherine with her psychology degree, their daughter Jessica's graduation from nursing school, the twins, Olivia and Nathan, as babies, then toddlers, now teenagers. Time marked in silver frames, while Eleanor herself seemed suspended in it. Before the bump, Eleanor had been someone else entirely, confident, purposeful, the most sought-after trauma nurse in her MASH unit, with steady hands that never trembled even as bombs fell nearby. She and Diane Miller had been inseparable, 2 female nurses proving themselves daily in a war that would later try to forget their contributions. "You'll run this hospital someday," Diane used to tell her, dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "If we make it home, that is." They hadn't both made it home. At least, that's what Eleanor had believed for 30 years. The bump appeared 6 months after Eleanor returned from Iraq, a small, painless lump just below her right shoulder blade. She discovered it while showering, fingers brushing over the slight protrusion. "Probably nothing," she muttered to her reflection. Catherine's voice in her head saying, "Get that checked, Ellie." She ignored it, just as she'd ignored the nightmares, the flinching at loud noises, the way she automatically checked exits whenever entering a room. Women in the Reynolds family didn't run to doctors for every little thing. Her mother had taught her that before cancer took her at 55, an irony not lost on Eleanor as she adjusted her shirts to hide the growing bump. Catherine had tried everything to get her to see someone. "It's getting bigger, Ellie," she'd note, concern deepening the lines around her eyes. But Eleanor was stubborn. The bump became their unspoken third companion, growing slowly but steadily as the years passed. By the time Catherine was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2010, the bump had grown to the size of a golf ball. In her final months, as autumn painted Massachusetts in shades of fire, Catherine made Eleanor promise, "After I'm gone, get that thing looked at. Don't carry burdens alone anymore." Eleanor had nodded, tears blurring her vision, another promise she wouldn't keep. When Catherine passed, Eleanor retreated further into solitude, the bump her constant, silent companion, a physical manifestation of all she couldn't express. Now, a decade later, it had grown to the size of a small orange, hidden beneath carefully arranged scarves and loose clothing, causing pain that kept her awake at night. Only her granddaughter Olivia, with her medical student's knowledge and her grandmother's stubborn determination, had finally forced the issue. What Eleanor couldn't possibly know was that the bump held not just the physical remnants of her past, but the key to unlocking the truth she'd buried along with her grief. "Grandma, this isn't up for discussion anymore." Olivia Reynolds stood in Eleanor's kitchen, medical textbook open on the counter, her mother Jessica beside her with arms crossed in silent solidarity. At 20, Olivia had Catherine's analytical mind and Eleanor's unflinching determination, a combination that left little room for argument. "It's just a lipoma," Eleanor countered, adjusting her position in the wooden chair to ease the persistent pressure against her spine. "Common in people my age, nothing to make such a fuss about." "A lipoma doesn't cause the symptoms you're experiencing," Olivia pointed out, her finger tracing a diagram in the textbook. "The location is concerning, right against your thoracic spine. See this?" She turned the book toward Eleanor. "The compression could eventually cause nerve damage. Permanent nerve damage, Grandma." Eleanor sipped her tea, avoiding her granddaughter's gaze. The pain had indeed worsened over the past year, radiating down her right arm, making sleep nearly impossible unless she positioned herself just so in her recliner. But doctors meant hospitals. Hospitals meant memories. And Medicare would only cover so much. "I'm on a fixed income," Eleanor said finally. "My retirement doesn't stretch far enough for unnecessary procedures." Jessica sighed, pulling out a chair to sit across from her mother. "Mom, we've been through this. My insurance can cover you as a dependent. The paperwork is already filed. I'm not going to be a burden on your family." "You're not a burden. You're my mother." Jessica reached for Eleanor's hand. "And you promised Mom you'd get it checked before she died." Eleanor flinched, as if struck. Catherine had made her promise. Those final autumn days when pain medications pulled her into restless sleep, leaving Eleanor to sit vigil beside their bed. "After I'm gone," Catherine had whispered, "don't shut down like after the war and get that bump looked at." Another broken promise in a life increasingly defined by them. "Nathan's coming home next weekend," Olivia added, strategically changing tactics. "He'd want to see you healthy before he starts basic training." The mention of her grandson heading to military service sent a familiar chill through Eleanor. Nathan, with his earnest eyes and easy smile, enlisting because of stories she'd told him, sanitized versions that emphasized service over sacrifice, duty over damage. "Low blow, Livy," Eleanor murmured, but without heat. "I learned from the best," Olivia replied, the ghost of a smile crossing her face. As her family continued their gentle but relentless campaign, Eleanor's mind drifted back to the last time she'd been cornered like this. Diane beside her in the mess tent, both of them running on coffee and adrenaline after 36 hours of triage. "You need sleep, Ellie," Diane had insisted. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." "There's another transport coming in," Eleanor had argued. "They need every nurse." "They need conscious nurses who can tell a scalpel from a spoon," Diane had countered, physically steering her toward the women's quarters. 4 hours. I'll wake you if the world ends." The memory came with such clarity that Eleanor could almost smell the desert dust, feel the oppressive heat, hear the distant thump of helicopters. How many times had Diane forced her to rest, to eat, to acknowledge her limits? And how had Eleanor repaid that care? By leaving her behind. "Mom?" Jessica's voice pulled her back to the present, concern etched across her features. "Where did you go just now?" Eleanor shook her head. "Nowhere important." She straightened in her chair, decision made. "Fine, one appointment, but I'm not promising anything beyond that." The relief on their faces was almost comical. What they didn't understand was that Eleanor had finally calculated the costs and benefits. Nathan's impending deployment tipped the scales. She refused to saddle him with worry while he was training. Better to confirm it was nothing, and put everyone's mind at ease before he left. The appointment with Dr. Rivera was scheduled for the following Thursday. Eleanor spent the intervening days preparing as if for battle, organizing her financial paperwork, cleaning the house obsessively, even updating her will, actions that spoke louder than her dismissive words about a simple checkup. Dr. Rivera, a woman perhaps 20 years Eleanor's junior with kind eyes and no-nonsense manner, listened carefully to the history of the growth before examining it. 30 years, she repeated, eyebrows rising. And it's been growing consistently? More rapidly in the last few years, Eleanor admitted. The doctor's fingers probed gently around the mass. Any pain? Numbness? Tingling? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Some. Down my right arm mostly, worse at night. Dr. Rivera's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor caught the subtle shift in her posture. I'd like to order an MRI, Mrs. Reynolds. The location concerns me, very close to your spine. Is that really necessary? Couldn't you just remove it and be done? I could, Dr. Rivera agreed, but I'd be doing so blindly. The MRI will show us exactly what we're dealing with, its relationship to surrounding structures, and help determine the best surgical approach. Surgical? Given its size and location, yes, I strongly recommend removal. This isn't just a cosmetic issue anymore. Eleanor stared at the diplomas on the wall, evidence of this woman's expertise that should have been reassuring but instead felt like a trap closing around her. Surgery meant anesthesia. Anesthesia meant surrendering control. And hospitals. Hospitals meant the smell of antiseptic overlaying the metallic scent of blood, the beeping of monitors that transformed into incoming mortar warnings in her dreams. Mrs. Reynolds, Dr. Rivera said gently, the MRI might also tell us if this is something other than a lipoma. You think it's cancer? Not a question. I think it's been growing for 30 years without medical evaluation, and that deserves thorough investigation. 2 days later, Eleanor lay inside the claustrophobic MRI tube, forcing herself to breathe evenly as the machine clattered around her. The technician had offered headphones with music, but Eleanor declined. She preferred to hear the enemy approaching. When Dr. Rivera called the following Monday, her voice carried the careful neutrality that Eleanor recognized from her own days delivering uncertain news to patients' families. The MRI shows a complex mass, the doctor explained. It's not a simple lipoma as we hoped. There appear to be anomalies within the structure, meaning there are what look like foreign objects embedded in the mass, and there's significant compression of your spinal cord. I've scheduled you with our top neurosurgeon, Dr. Foster, for tomorrow. Foreign objects. The phrase echoed in Eleanor's mind long after she hung up. What could possibly be inside her? She'd never had surgery in that area, never been injured there, except the day she lost Diane, the day the rocket hit their field hospital, the day she'd carried her friend's bleeding body through chaos, only to be told later that Diane hadn't survived. That night, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out the box of war memorabilia she kept in the back of her closet. Her fingers trembled as she sorted through the items, her faded uniform with the captain's bars, photographs of her medical unit, commendation letters, and at the bottom, a Purple Heart she'd received for injuries sustained during the rocket attack. Injuries she barely remembered in the fog of grief that followed. The medical report mentioned shrapnel wounds to her back and shoulder, treated and deemed minor compared to her other injuries. Could some fragment have remained, worked its way deeper over time? As she replaced the items, her fingers brushed something unexpected, a worn envelope addressed in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. Eleanor didn't recognize it. Opening it revealed a letter dated just weeks before Catherine's death. My dearest Ellie, it began. If you're reading this, it means you finally decided to confront the past you carry with you, both literally and figuratively. Eleanor's breath caught. How had Catherine known? I've carried a secret these past 15 years, the letter continued. One I meant to share before the end, but courage fails me as strength does. I found her, Ellie. Diane Miller didn't die that day in Iraq. The letter fluttered from Eleanor's suddenly numb fingers, landing face up on the carpet. The final line visible. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. Forgive yourself for what you couldn't control. The room tilted around Eleanor, past and present colliding with dizzying force. If Diane was alive, had been alive all these years, then what exactly had Eleanor been carrying, both in her heart and in her body? The answer would come sooner than she expected, in an operating room where the burden of 30 years would finally be revealed, with consequences none of them could have imagined. Eleanor sat in Dr. Foster's office, Catherine's letter folded in her pocket like a talisman. She'd read it a dozen times since discovering it last night, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new questions without answers. The MRI shows a mass approximately the size of a tennis ball, Dr. Foster explained, pointing to shadowy images on her computer screen. But what's unusual is the composition. These lighter areas here suggest metallic fragments embedded within the tissue. Eleanor stared at the ghostly images of her own body, trying to reconcile the clinical assessment with the emotional earthquake of Catherine's revelation. Could it be shrapnel? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Foster nodded. That would be my guess. Were you injured during your military service? Rocket attack in Iraq, 1991. I was treated for shrapnel wounds, but they were considered minor. I was distracted at the time. Eleanor swallowed hard. A close friend was killed in the same attack. At least I thought she was. Something in her tone made Dr. Foster look up from the images, studying Eleanor's face. You're saying you recently learned otherwise? Last night. My late wife apparently knew. The betrayal still stung, sharp and fresh. She left me a letter before she died, but I only found it yesterday. Dr. Foster leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. Mrs. Reynolds, normally I'd say personal matters should wait until after medical issues are resolved, but in my experience, these things are often connected, especially with long-term physical manifestations like your mass. You think my body grew around this shrapnel because of what? Guilt? Grief? The body keeps the score, as they say in trauma research. I've seen remarkable physical responses to emotional wounds. Dr. Foster turned back to the screen. What concerns me most is the location. The mass is compressing your spinal cord. If we don't remove it soon, you risk permanent nerve damage, possibly paralysis. The word hung in the air between them. Paralysis, another burden, heavier than the one she already carried. How soon? Eleanor asked. I've cleared my schedule for tomorrow morning. That fast? Dr. Foster's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Reynolds, you've already waited 30 years. I don't think you should wait another day. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of pre-surgical consultations, paperwork, and phone calls. Jessica arrived with an overnight bag and determination in her eyes. Olivia brought medical journals and a list of questions for Dr. Foster. Nathan video-called from his pre-enlistment training, his young face serious as he promised to be there in spirit. You've raised quite the support squad, the night nurse commented as she checked Eleanor's vitals for the third time. Eleanor managed a tight smile. They get their stubbornness from their grandfather. Catherine never took no for an answer either. When Jessica and Olivia finally left for the night, promising to return before dawn, Eleanor found herself alone with thoughts too loud for the quiet hospital room. She reached for the call button, then hesitated. What would she even ask for? Nothing could calm the storm in her mind. Instead, She pulled out a notepad from the bedside table and began to write. "Dear Olivia and Nathan," she began, pen hovering over paper. What did one write on the eve of surgery that might uncover 3 decades of buried truths? Not a goodbye. Doctor Foster had assured her the procedure was routine despite the mass's size. Not a confession. Some burdens were hers alone to carry. Yet, something compelled her to commit words to paper, as if the impending surgery had loosened something long locked away. "If you're reading this, it means I'm too stubborn to tell you these things to your faces," she continued, allowing herself a small smile. "There are things a person carries that aren't visible, things heavier than any growth on the back. I've carried such things since before your mother was born." The pen moved more quickly now, decades of unspoken thoughts finding release. "There was a woman named Diane Miller, best trauma nurse in our unit. Could start an IV in a moving ambulance with one hand while holding pressure on a wound with the other. Always had a joke, even when we were knee-deep in casualties with supplies running low. Had a fiancé back home named Robert who sent her mystery novels that she shared with everyone." Eleanor's hand began to shake, forcing her to pause momentarily. The memories, usually kept at bay by bourbon and busy work, flooded back with overwhelming clarity. It was near Dhahran, chaos everywhere after the rocket hit our field hospital. Diane and I were separated from our unit, trying to stabilize patients in what remained of the triage tent. There was an explosion. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. The weight of her as I carried her through smoke and debris. The blood that wouldn't stop no matter how hard I pressed on the wound. Her voice growing weaker, telling me to leave her, to save myself. I didn't leave her. I couldn't. But I couldn't save her either. The pen stilled again as Eleanor's throat constricted with emotion she'd refused to acknowledge for over 30 years. They told me later she died before we reached the backup medical unit, that nothing could have been done. I received a Purple Heart for bringing her body back through an active attack zone. They called me a hero. Eleanor's writing grew jagged, matching her emotions. I am not a hero. Heroes save people. I just carried a dead woman through hell. Eleanor became aware of moisture on her cheeks and brushed it away roughly with the back of her hand. Women of her generation didn't cry. Certainly not Reynolds women. "I never told your grandmother the full story. She knew I had nightmares, knew there were nights I'd wake up shouting Diane's name, but I spared her the details. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe if I talked about it, things would have been different." She glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. In a few hours, they would wheel her into an operating room where the physical manifestation of her burden would finally be removed. But what would remain of her once it was gone? "I don't know why I'm telling you this now," she continued. "Perhaps it's the prospect of surgery. Perhaps it's just an old woman's rambling. But I want you to know that whatever they find tomorrow, whatever happens, I've lived a life weighted by things unsaid. Don't make my mistake. Don't carry burdens alone until they become too heavy to bear." Eleanor set down the pen and stared at the letter. The confession felt both liberating and terrifying. Would they think less of her? Would they see the cowardice beneath the stoic exterior she'd maintained all these years? "Mom?" Eleanor startled, turning to find Jessica standing in the doorway, her nurse's scrub suggesting she'd come straight from her night shift. "What are you doing back here?" Eleanor asked, attempting to discreetly cover the letter with her hand. Jessica crossed the room, the weariness in her movements reminding Eleanor that her daughter was no longer young herself. Middle age had crept up on her while Eleanor wasn't paying attention. "Couldn't sleep knowing you were alone," Jessica said, eyes landing on the partially concealed paper. "What's that?" Eleanor hesitated, then slowly removed her hand. "Just putting some thoughts down." Jessica's eyes scanned the visible portion of the letter, then lifted to meet her mother's gaze. "Mom," she said softly, "why haven't you ever talked about this?" "People of my generation didn't talk about such things," Eleanor said, the response automatic. "We came home. We moved on. We built lives." "Did you?" Jessica asked, pulling the visitor's chair closer and sitting down. "Move on?" The question hung in the air between them, simple yet devastating in its accuracy. "I thought I had," Eleanor finally said, "until your mother got sick. Then everything unraveled." Jessica reached for her hand, her touch gentle yet firm, the touch of someone accustomed to providing comfort. "Mom would have wanted you to talk about it to get help." "Your mother wanted a lot of things I couldn't give her," Eleanor admitted, the confession bitter on her tongue. "She wanted you to be happy, Mom. That's all she ever wanted." Eleanor looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw Catherine in the determined set of her jaw, in the compassionate eyes that missed nothing. "I've disappointed you," she said, the realization bringing fresh pain. Jessica shook her head. "No, you've worried me. There's a difference." "All these years, the bump, I should have—" "Yes, you should have," Eleanor interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "But we're here now. Tomorrow they'll remove it and I can start fresh." Eleanor glanced down at the letter. "I'm not sure I know how to do that anymore." "Nobody does," Jessica said with a small smile. "We just fumble through and hope for the best. That's what Mom always said, remember?" Eleanor did remember. Catherine's practical philosophy had been a ballast during their 40 years together. "Your mother was a wise woman. She married you, didn't she?" Jessica's attempt at lightening the mood worked, drawing a reluctant smile from Eleanor. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the ticking of the wall clock marking the passage of time. "You should try to sleep," Jessica finally said. "I'll stay here tonight. Olivia's bringing Nathan over in the morning to go to the hospital with us." Eleanor nodded, suddenly exhausted. The emotional toll of writing the letter, of speaking truths long buried, had drained what little energy she'd had. As Jessica helped her adjust positions to accommodate the IV line, Eleanor felt an unfamiliar sensation, not the physical discomfort she'd grown accustomed to, but something lighter. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally began to claim her, this was what the first step toward unburdening felt like. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the hospital blinds and the bustle of shift change in the hallway. Eleanor opened her eyes to find Nathan sitting beside her bed, her letter open in his hands. "Morning, Grandma," Nathan said, his expression unreadable. At 18, he already had the composed demeanor of a soldier, the result of years in ROTC and a lifetime of preparing to follow in the footsteps of a grandmother he knew mainly through silence and stoicism. Eleanor felt exposed, vulnerable in a way physical nakedness could never achieve. "You read it?" It wasn't a question, but Nathan nodded anyway. "Mom thought we should before the surgery." Eleanor couldn't bring herself to ask the real question. "Do you think less of me now?" Nathan carefully refolded the letter, his movements deliberate. "My ROTC commander says the strongest soldiers are the ones who acknowledge their wounds, not just the ones on their skin." Before Eleanor could respond, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her expression softer than Eleanor had seen in months. "Time to go, Grandma. Today's the day you finally get rid of your unwanted companion." As they wheeled her toward the operating room, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she had already begun a different kind of surgery, the excision of secrets too long carried alone. The operating room hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern medicine. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking Eleanor Reynolds' vital signs as the anesthesiologist carefully maintained her sedation. Dr. Foster worked with methodical precision, her experienced hands making the initial incision across the prominent mass that had been Eleanor's unwanted companion for nearly 3 decades. "Tissue appears consistent with a sebaceous cyst," she commented to the surgical team. "Much larger than typical, though. The capsule is well defined." Nurse Jenkins adjusted the overhead light, providing better illumination as Dr. Foster began the delicate process of separating the mass from surrounding tissues. The growth had established itself in an inconvenient location, nestled against the thoracic spine with numerous nerve roots in dangerous proximity. "We'll need to go slowly here," Dr. Foster cautioned. "There's significant vascularity, and we don't want to disturb the spinal cord." For 20 minutes, the surgery progressed exactly as expected. The careful dissection of a large but otherwise unremarkable cyst. The team worked in the focused silence of routine, the only sounds the steady beep of monitors and occasional requests for instruments. "Almost there," Dr. Foster murmured, more to herself than the team. "Just need to free this last attachment near the spine." Her hand suddenly froze mid-motion. The scalpel hovered, trembling slightly. "Dr. Foster?" Nurse Jenkins prompted after several seconds of uncharacteristic stillness. "There's something—" Her voice trailed off as she carefully retracted the tissue. "Hand me the finer forceps, please." The atmosphere in the operating room shifted, tension rising as Dr. Foster delicately probed deeper into the mass. Her expression, visible only through her eyes above her surgical mask, changed from concentration to disbelief. "What is it?" the resident assisting her asked. Dr. Foster didn't immediately answer, instead working with heightened focus to expose what had caught her attention. "There's a foreign object embedded in the capsule. Metallic." The surgical team exchanged glances. Finding foreign bodies wasn't unheard of, but within an otherwise typical cyst, unusual to say the least. "Looks like it's been there for decades," Dr. Foster continued, carefully freeing the object from surrounding tissue. "The body has completely encapsulated it." As she extracted the item, the operating room fell silent. Even the steady beeping of monitors seemed to fade into the background as every eye focused on the small, tarnished piece of metal in Dr. Foster's forceps. "Are those—" Nurse Jenkins began. "Dog tags," Dr. Foster confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Military dog tags." The resident leaned closer. "How is that possible?" "A cyst doesn't form around foreign objects like this." "This isn't just a cyst," Dr. Foster said, examining the growth with new understanding. "This is something I've never seen before. The body has created a protective capsule around the tags, almost like a biological safe." "Extraordinary," breathed Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, the pathologist who had just entered the operating room in response to an urgent page. She approached the table, her experienced eyes widening at the sight. "The tissue has formed a perfect preservation chamber." Dr. Foster carefully placed the tags in a specimen dish that Nurse Jenkins held out. "Can you make out the name?" Dr. Blackwood leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "Miller, Diane A. Blood type O positive. Religious preference, Protestant." She looked up, meeting Dr. Foster's gaze. "These aren't Mrs. Reynolds' tags." "No," Dr. Foster agreed, returning her attention to the surgical field. "And there might be more." Her prediction proved accurate. As they continued the careful dissection, a second metallic object emerged, a fragment of what appeared to be shrapnel, approximately the size of a dime, darkened with age but preserved within the same biological capsule that had housed the tags. "I need to complete the removal," Dr. Foster said, refocusing on the primary surgical objective. "But I want this entire specimen sent to pathology intact. This is unprecedented." The remainder of the surgery proceeded with heightened care. the team working to remove the mass without disrupting the remarkable biological adaptation they'd discovered. What had begun as a routine procedure had transformed into something none of them had encountered in their medical careers. 90 minutes later, Dr. Foster placed the final suture, securing the surgical site with meticulous attention. The mass, now removed and preserved in a specimen container, would head directly to pathology for comprehensive analysis. "I've been a surgeon for 25 years, Dr. Foster said as she stepped back from the table, "and I've never seen anything like this. The human body never ceases to amaze me." As the team prepared to transfer Eleanor to recovery, Dr. Foster's thoughts turned to the conversation that would follow when her patient awoke. How does one explain to a woman that she's been carrying not just a cyst, but a piece of history, perhaps her own history, embedded in her body for what must have been half a century? The recovery room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors and occasional murmurs of nurses checking on patients. Eleanor Reynolds lay still, her breathing steady as the anesthesia gradually released its hold. The white bandage at the base of her neck stood in stark contrast to her sun-weathered skin. Dr. Foster sat beside the bed, the specimen container holding the dog tags on the table next to her. She'd debated waiting until Eleanor was fully recovered before sharing the discovery, but something told her this patient had waited long enough for truth. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, then opened. Confusion clouded her gaze momentarily before focusing on Dr. Foster. "It's done?" Her voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. "Yes, Mrs. Reynolds. The surgery went well. We were able to remove the entire mass." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively toward her neck, stopping short of the bandaged area. "Feels strange, lighter." "I imagine it does, after carrying it for so many years." Dr. Foster paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Mrs. Reynolds, we found something unexpected during the surgery, something inside the growth." A flicker of emotion, was it fear, resignation, crossed Eleanor's face. "Cancer?" "No, nothing like that." Dr. Foster reached for the specimen container. "We found these." Eleanor's eyes, still foggy from anesthesia, struggled to focus on the container. When recognition dawned, the color drained from her face. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I assure you it is. These dog tags were embedded deep within the tissue. They've been there for many years, judging by the condition of both the tags and the biological response around them." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the container, her fingers pressing against the clear plastic as if trying to touch the tags themselves. "Diane Miller," she read, her voice breaking on the name. "You know her?" Dr. Foster said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling with increasingly rapid breaths. The monitor beside her bed registered the spike in her heart rate. "Mrs. Reynolds, try to stay calm. You're still recovering from anesthesia." Dr. Foster placed a steadying hand on Eleanor's arm. "We don't need to discuss this now if it's too difficult." "No." Eleanor's eyes opened, suddenly clear and focused with an intensity that belied her post-surgical state. "I've waited 32 years. I'm not waiting another minute." Dr. Foster nodded, understanding the determination in the older woman's voice. "Would you like me to call your family in?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Jessica. Just Jessica for now." While a nurse went to fetch Eleanor's daughter, Dr. Foster observed her patient's face, the play of emotions across features that had maintained stoic reserve throughout their previous interactions. Whatever story lay behind those dog tags, it was clearly one that had shaped Eleanor Reynolds' life in profound ways. Jessica entered the recovery room moments later, her nurse's training evident in the way she quickly assessed her mother's condition before allowing relief to soften her expression. "The surgery went well?" she asked, looking to Dr. Foster for confirmation, even as she took her mother's hand. "Very well," Dr. Foster assured her. "But we made an unexpected discovery that your mother wants to discuss." Jessica's gaze shifted to the specimen container, her brow furrowing in confusion at the sight of the dog tags. "Mom?" she prompted gently. Eleanor drew a shaky breath. "It's Diane's tags," she said, her voice suddenly sounding every one of her 60 years. "Diane Miller from Iraq." Jessica looked between her mother and the dog tags, comprehension slowly dawning. "The nurse you mentioned in your letter? The one you couldn't save?" Eleanor nodded, a single tear tracking down her weathered cheek. "I've been carrying her with me all this time, and I didn't even know it." Dr. Foster watched this exchange with growing understanding. The letter Jessica mentioned must have contained part of this story, a story that clearly held profound significance for her patient. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said gently, "from a medical perspective, what we found is extraordinary. Your body created a specialized capsule around these foreign objects, preserving them while protecting your own tissues from damage. It's a biological adaptation I've never encountered before." Eleanor hardly seemed to register the doctor's words, her focus fixed on the dog tags. "I thought they were buried with her," she murmured. "They told me she was laid to rest with full military honors." Dr. Foster exchanged a glance with Jessica, both recognizing the need to proceed carefully. "Mrs. Reynolds, these tags raise some questions about what actually happened. Would it help to speak with someone from Veterans Affairs? Perhaps they could provide information about Diane Miller's records." Eleanor's gaze snapped to Dr. Foster's face, sudden hope lighting her eyes with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "Records? You think there might be more information about what happened to her?" "It's possible," Dr. Foster said cautiously. "Military record-keeping has improved significantly in recent decades, especially with digitization efforts." Jessica squeezed her mother's hand. "Mom, let's focus on your recovery first. Once you're stronger—" "No," Eleanor interrupted with unexpected firmness. "I've waited too long already. If there's any chance of learning the truth about Diane, I need to know." She turned to Dr. Foster. "How soon can I get out of here, Doc?" Dr. Foster couldn't help but smile at the transformation in her patient. The woman who had reluctantly dragged herself to a consultation a week ago was now ready to discharge herself in pursuit of answers. "Typically, I'd want to keep you overnight for observation after removing a mass of that size," she explained. "But I understand the urgency you feel. Let's compromise. Stay until tomorrow morning. Give your body a chance to recover from the anesthesia, and then we'll discuss discharge." Eleanor seemed about to protest, but Jessica interjected. "That's more than fair, Mom. Besides, it will give me time to contact the VA and see what information we might be able to access." Reluctantly, Eleanor agreed. As the initial surge of adrenaline faded, the reality of her post-surgical condition began to assert itself in waves of discomfort and fatigue. "Rest now," Dr. Foster advised, standing to leave. "We'll talk more when you're feeling stronger." As she turned to go, Eleanor called after her. "Doc, thank you. Not just for the surgery, but for—" She gestured toward the dog tags, seemingly unable to articulate the full significance of the discovery. Dr. Foster nodded in understanding. "Sometimes the body keeps secrets even from ourselves, Mrs. Reynolds. I'm glad we could bring this one to light." After the doctor left, Jessica pulled her chair closer to her mother's bedside. "Do you want to talk about it? About Diane?" Eleanor looked at her daughter, perhaps seeing for the first time how much she had kept from her over the years, how many pieces of herself she had hidden away, just as her body had hidden those dog tags. "Yes," she said finally, "I think it's time I told you the whole story." As Eleanor began to speak, memories she had suppressed for decades came flooding back with vivid clarity. The desert heat of Iraq, the weight of combat gear in sweltering conditions, and Diane Miller's voice, always ready with encouragement even in the darkest moments. For the first time in 32 years, Eleanor Reynolds allowed herself to remember fully, not just the guilt and grief she had carried, but the friendship that had preceded the loss. And as she spoke, the burden she had carried seemed to lighten, just as her back now felt strangely weightless without its longtime companion. The dog tags gleamed under the recovery room lights, a physical manifestation of the past that had shaped her, a past that perhaps wasn't fully laid to rest after all. 3 days after surgery, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the dog tags resting on a clean handkerchief before her. She'd spent hours staring at them, running her fingers over the embossed letters. Miller, Diane, A. The metal was worn smooth in places, tarnished in others, bearing silent witness to decades encased within her body. The house was quiet. Jessica had reluctantly returned to work after Eleanor insisted she could manage on her own. "I've been taking care of myself since before you were born," she'd reminded her. Though they both knew self-care had never been her strong suit, her back felt strange, lighter certainly, but also vulnerable. The surgical site was healing well, according to Dr. Foster at yesterday's follow-up appointment, but Eleanor kept expecting to feel the familiar weight and pressure that had been her constant companion for nearly 30 years. The doorbell rang, startling her from her reverie. Eleanor carefully folded the handkerchief around the dog tags before making her way to the front door. Olivia stood on the porch, a manila folder tucked under her arm and determination written across her young face. "Thought you'd be at your classes," Eleanor said by way of greeting, stepping aside to let her in. "Took the morning off," Olivia replied, her eyes quickly assessing her grandmother with the clinical gaze she'd developed during her pre-med studies. "You look better, more color in your face." Eleanor grunted non-committally and led the way back to the kitchen. "Coffee's still hot." Olivia helped herself to a mug from the cabinet, Catherine's favorite, Eleanor noted with a pang, and settled across from her at the table. She placed the folder between them but didn't open it immediately. "Mom told me about the dog tags," she said, her direct approach reminiscent of Catherine. "About Diane Miller." Eleanor nodded, unwrapping the handkerchief to reveal the tags. "Still can't believe they were inside me all this time." "I've been doing some research," Olivia continued, tapping the folder. "Called in some favors at the VA where I volunteer." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "And?" Olivia opened the folder with deliberate care, revealing photocopied documents bearing military insignia. "Diane A. Miller, Lieutenant U.S. Army Nurse Corps, served in Iraq from 1990 to 1991. Eleanor nodded. "We were in the same MASH unit, 5th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital." "She was reported missing in action in February 1991, Olivia continued, "following a rocket attack near Dharan." "Not missing," Eleanor corrected, her voice rough with emotion. "She died in my arms. I carried her body back to our lines." Olivia's eyes softened with compassion. "That's what you believed happened, Grandma. But according to these records, she was listed as MIA, not KIA. Eleanor stared at her uncomprehendingly. "That's impossible. I was there. I felt her go still. They took her body from me at the field hospital." "Did you actually see her pronounced dead by a doctor?" Olivia asked gently. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The memories of that day had always been fragmented, distorted by pain, exhaustion, and what she now recognized as the early symptoms of what would later be called PTSD. "I was injured too," she said slowly. "Took shrapnel in my back and shoulder. They gave me morphine when we reached the medical unit. Everything after that is blurry." Olivia nodded, turning to another document in the folder. "There's more, Grandma." According to this report, dated April 1991, a wounded American nurse was found by an Allied patrol that had been separated from their unit. She was later identified as Diane A. Miller. The kitchen seemed to tilt around Eleanor. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, the implications of Olivia's words crashing over her in waves. She was alive? Eleanor's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. She was taken to a field hospital in Saudi Arabia, Olivia confirmed, her expression gentle but firm, giving her grandmother time to process each piece of information. She was in critical condition with severe injuries to her right arm and internal bleeding. She remained in a coma for several weeks. Eleanor shook her head in disbelief. That's not possible. They would have notified me. Her family would have known. The records indicate her identification was complicated by severe injuries and initial confusion about her identity. By the time she was properly identified, you had been evacuated to Germany for your own injuries. Eleanor's thoughts raced, memories recalibrating against this new reality. Are you telling me that Diane survived? That she came home? Olivia hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share at once. According to these records, yes, she was repatriated in late 1991 and received medical treatment at Walter Reed for nearly a year. A year? Eleanor echoed, imagining the severity of injuries that would require such prolonged care. She lost her right arm above the elbow, Olivia said quietly, and suffered other significant injuries. But she survived, Grandma. She came home. Eleanor stared at the dog tags, gleaming dully on the handkerchief. For 32 years, she'd carried the weight of Diane's death, a burden that had shaped her entire life. The guilt, the nightmares, the emotional walls she'd built between herself and everyone except Catherine, all based on a truth that wasn't true at all. Where is she now? Eleanor asked, afraid to hope, yet unable to stop herself. Olivia turned to the final page in the folder. Her last known address was in Nashville, Tennessee. As of 3 years ago, she was still living there. Tennessee, Eleanor repeated. That's only a day's drive from here. We don't know what kind of life she's had, what kind of woman she is now. Olivia began cautiously. War changes people, and she endured things we can't imagine. I have to find her, Eleanor said, the decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. I have to know if she's still alive. Olivia nodded, having anticipated this reaction. I thought you might say that. I've already called the VA office in Tennessee. They can't give us personal information, but they've agreed to pass along a message if she's still in their system. Eleanor reached across the table and covered her granddaughter's hand with her own, a rare gesture of physical affection. Thank you, Olivia, for all of this. She smiled, turning her hand to squeeze her grandmother's. There's one more thing. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, rectangular device. I recorded our conversation with the VA officer. There's something you should hear. She pressed a button, and a woman's professional voice filled the kitchen. While I can't confirm current contact information for privacy reasons, I can tell you that Ms. Miller has been a regular at our veteran support services until quite recently. She's well known in our community. Olivia stopped the recording. She's telling us Diane is alive, Grandma, as of a few months ago at least. Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. I need to go there. Now. Whoa, Olivia cautioned, standing to place a steadying hand on her arm. You just had major surgery 3 days ago. Dr. Foster said no driving for at least a week and no trips for 2. I've waited 32 years, Eleanor insisted. I'm not waiting another 2 weeks. Then let me drive you, Olivia countered. Mom has shifts all weekend and Nathan is home on leave. We could leave Friday after my last class. Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist on leaving immediately, but the surgical site throbbed as if in warning. At 60, recovery didn't come as quickly as it once had. Friday, she conceded reluctantly. Olivia nodded, relief evident in her expression. "I'll make the arrangements. But Grandma," she added, her tone sobering, "you need to prepare yourself for all possibilities. She might not want to see you." "She might not be the Diane you remember." Eleanor nodded, knowing she was right but unwilling to consider any scenario that might delay the meeting. "I just need to return these to her," she said, indicating the dog tags. "The rest is up to her." The interstate stretched before them, a ribbon of concrete cutting through the Tennessee countryside. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat of Olivia's Honda, the dog tags tucked securely in the pocket of her blouse, a constant reminder of the purpose behind this journey. Her surgical sight ached dully, but she'd refused the stronger painkillers, needing clarity for what lay ahead. "You should try to sleep," Olivia suggested, glancing over at her grandmother. "We've still got 3 hours to go." "Haven't slept well in 30 years, Eleanor replied, eyes fixed on the rolling hills beyond the window. "Don't expect to start now." Nathan, occupying the back seat with an assortment of maps and printouts, leaned forward. "Tell us more about her, Grandma. About Diane." Eleanor hesitated, the habit of silence deeply ingrained. But as the miles passed beneath their wheels, taking her closer to a reunion she'd never thought possible, the stories began to flow. Tales of field hospitals and shared MREs, of Diane's talent for finding humor in the bleakest situations, of the night they'd sat on watch together, and Diane had confided her dreams for after the war. A teaching position at a nursing school, a house with a garden, a return to the normalcy that seemed impossibly distant in the desert. She loved growing plants, Eleanor recalled, the memory surfacing with surprising clarity. Said her grandmother had taught her about medicinal herbs. She kept these tiny succulents on our barracks windowsill. God knows where she found them in Iraq. As Eleanor spoke, the Diane of her memories came alive, no longer frozen in that final terrible moment when Eleanor had believed her dead, but fully realized, a young woman of courage, humor, and profound humanity. "She sounds like someone worth finding," Olivia said softly as Eleanor paused, her voice rough with emotion. "She was the best of us," Eleanor agreed. "Better than I ever was." By late afternoon they crossed into the outskirts of Nashville. The landscape had changed, giving way to suburban developments and increasing traffic. Olivia navigated carefully, following the direction she'd researched, while Nathan checked the address against his phone's GPS. "The VA officer couldn't give us her exact address," Olivia reminded them as they turned onto a tree-lined street of modest bungalows. "But she mentioned Diane volunteers at the Veterans Center every Thursday. That's today." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. After decades of believing Diane dead, after days of grappling with the truth that she had survived, the reality of seeing her again in mere minutes seemed impossible to process. The Veterans Center occupied a renovated Victorian house, its wide porch adorned with American flags and a sign welcoming all who had served. The parking lot held a dozen cars, evidence of an active community gathering. "Are you ready for this?" Jessica asked, having met them in Nashville after her hospital shift, determined not to let her mother face this moment without her. Eleanor nodded, fingers reflexively touching the dog tags in her pocket. 32 years overdue. The four of them made their way up the porch steps, Eleanor moving more slowly than she would have liked, still mindful of her recent surgery. As they reached the door, it swung open from within, and a young man in his 20s emerged, holding it for them. "Welcome to Nashville Veterans Support Center," he said cheerfully. "First time visiting?" Eleanor could only nod, her voice suddenly absent. "Group session just finished, but there's coffee in the community room," he continued, gesturing down a hallway decorated with military memorabilia and photographs. "Feel free to look around." They entered a large room where about 15 people mingled, some in animated conversation, others quietly nursing cups of coffee. Mostly men, mostly Eleanor's age or older, with a scattering of younger veterans from more recent conflicts. Eleanor scanned the faces, searching for one that had haunted her dreams for 3 decades. Her pulse thundered in her ears, nearly drowning out the conversations around them. "Grandma," Olivia said softly, touching her arm and nodding toward a corner of the room. A woman stood with her back to them, silver-haired and slender, one sleeve of her blouse pinned neatly where her right arm should have been. She was speaking to an elderly man in a wheelchair, her head tilted attentively as she listened to his story. Something in her posture, in the way she leaned forward slightly when listening, struck Eleanor with such familiarity that her breath caught in her throat. Even without seeing her face, Eleanor knew. "Diane," she whispered, the name both prayer and revelation. As if hearing her name across the impossible distance of years, Diane Miller turned. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Eleanor with confusion that quickly transformed into disbelief. The coffee cup in her left hand froze midway to her lips. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply stared at each other, separated by 30 feet of worn carpet and 32 years of absence. Eleanor took one step forward, then another, dimly aware of her family hanging back, giving her this moment that belonged to her alone. Diane remained motionless, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something Eleanor couldn't quite name. When only a few feet separated them, Eleanor stopped, suddenly uncertain. What right did she have to disrupt this woman's life after so many decades? What if Diane blamed her for leaving her behind, for not making sure she was truly gone? "Ellie?" Diane's voice, deeper than Eleanor remembered, but with the same gentle cadence that had soothed wounded soldiers and homesick nurses alike. "Is that really you?" Eleanor nodded, words failing her completely. "My God," Diane whispered, carefully setting her coffee cup on a nearby table. "How did you? Why are you?" She shook her head, seemingly as overwhelmed as Eleanor. "I thought you were dead," Eleanor finally managed, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the room. "For 32 years, I thought I'd lost you in that field hospital." Diane's eyes widened, a flash of understanding crossing her features. "And I thought you'd left me behind," she said softly. "That you'd made it out and never looked back." The weight of 3 decades of misunderstanding hung between them, heavy as the dog tags in Eleanor's pocket. "I carried you," Eleanor said, each word an effort. "Through the smoke, you were bleeding so badly, I tried to stop it, but..." Her voice broke. "They told me you didn't make it." Diane took a step closer, close enough now that Eleanor could see the fine lines around her eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow that hadn't been there before, the depth of emotion in her gaze. "I don't remember much after the explosion," Diane admitted. "Just fragments, pain, being moved, voices I didn't recognize." She paused, studying Eleanor's face with careful intensity. "I never knew who got me out of there. The doctors said someone must have applied a makeshift tourniquet, kept me from bleeding out. That was you?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in her throat. Diane's expression softened, decades of questions finding answers in Eleanor's presence. "You saved my life." "But I left you," Eleanor countered, the guilt she'd carried for so long rising to the surface. "I handed you over to the medical team and then, I don't know. Everything after that is hazy. They told me later you hadn't survived." "And no one ever corrected that," Diane said, understanding dawning. "By the time I was conscious again, weeks had passed. They sent me stateside for surgeries. I tried to find you afterward, but..." The room around them seemed to fade away, the other veterans, the coffee cups, the flags and memorabilia, all receding as their shared past came sharply into focus. "Perhaps we should find somewhere more private to talk," Diane suggested, glancing at the curious onlookers their reunion had attracted. Eleanor nodded, gesturing toward her family who stood watching from a respectful distance. My daughter Jessica and my grandchildren Olivia and Nathan. They drove me here from Springfield. Diane's eyebrows rose. Springfield? You came all this way just to find me? Eleanor hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew the dog tags, holding them out on her palm. I came to return these to you. Diane stared at the tarnished metal, recognition and confusion battling across her features. My tags, she breathed. But how? I lost them during the attack. Where did you find them? The Veterans Center's director approached, concerned by the intensity of their exchange. Everything all right, Diane? Diane nodded, not taking her eyes from the dog tags. Very much so, Robert. This is Eleanor Reynolds, an old friend from Iraq. We served together. The man's expression shifted to understanding. Take the office if you need privacy, he offered, gesturing to a door off the main room. Thank you, Diane said, finally looking up at Eleanor. Would that be all right? I think we have a lot to catch up on. Eleanor glanced at Jessica, who nodded encouragingly. We'll wait, her daughter promised. Take all the time you need. The office was small but comfortable, with a desk, a worn leather sofa, and walls covered with photos of veterans' events. Diane closed the door behind them, then turned to face Eleanor, her composure slipping to reveal the emotional impact of their unexpected reunion. I never thought I'd see you again, she said simply. After all these years. Eleanor sank onto the sofa, suddenly aware of how much the day's journey had taxed her still recovering body. I never thought you were alive to be seen, she countered. Diane settled beside her, careful to leave space between them, a physical acknowledgement of the years that separated the women they had been from the women they'd become. My tags, she prompted gently. You were going to tell me how you found them. Eleanor took a deep breath. Where to begin a story that spanned 3 decades and involved a medical mystery? They were inside me, she said finally, found during my surgery 4 days ago. Diane's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Inside you? I don't understand. Neither do the doctors, Eleanor admitted. Somehow, during the rocket attack, your tags and a piece of shrapnel became embedded in my back. My body formed a growth around them, a cyst, the doctors called it. It's been growing for 32 years. She turned slightly, gesturing to where the bandage lay hidden beneath her blouse. Right here, below my shoulder blade. I felt it within months of coming home, but I never had it checked. Not until last week, when my granddaughter finally convinced me it needed medical attention. Diane listened with widening eyes, her medical training clearly engaging with this improbable scenario. That's extraordinary, she said finally. Medically fascinating, actually. The body's capacity to encapsulate foreign objects is well documented, but to create a growing cyst around them over such a prolonged period. Her clinical assessment faltered as the personal implications sank in. You've been carrying a piece of me all this time, she said softly. Literally carrying me with you, Eleanor nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Apparently so. And you never knew? Not until 4 days ago, when the surgeon found your tags during the operation. Eleanor hesitated, then added, but that's not entirely true. I've been carrying you in other ways. The guilt, the nightmares, the belief that I failed you, those have been with me every day since Iraq. Diane's expression softened with a compassion that pierced straight through Eleanor's defenses. Oh, Ellie, you didn't fail me. You saved me. But I left you, Eleanor insisted, the confession torn from some deep place within her. I handed you over to the medical team and I didn't stay to make sure. I didn't follow up. I just accepted what they told me without question. You were injured yourself, Diane reminded her. And in those conditions, with the chaos of war, she shook her head. No one could have done more than you did. Eleanor stared at her, This ghost made flesh, this woman who had every right to blame her, but instead offered absolution. How can you forgive so easily? There's nothing to forgive, Diane said firmly. And it's not easy. Nothing about what happened to us, to any of us over there, was easy. She gestured to her missing arm. I lost more than this in Iraq. We all did. But I refused to lose myself to bitterness, too. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the empty sleeve, then back to Diane's face. What happened after they found you? Diane settled back against the sofa, her posture suggesting she was preparing to share a long-buried story of her own. I was unconscious for nearly 2 weeks. When I woke up, I was already in Germany. The damage to my arm was too severe. They had to amputate. She delivered this information with the detached tone of someone who had long ago come to terms with an immutable fact. Spent 6 months at Walter Reed after that. Physical therapy, psychological counseling, learning to live with one arm. A small smile crossed her face. Turns out I'm remarkably stubborn. That I remember, Eleanor said, an answering smile tugging at her lips despite the gravity of their conversation. I tried to find you, Diane continued, her expression growing more serious. Once I was stable enough to think beyond the next surgery, the next therapy session. I asked about you, about everyone from our unit. They told me you'd been injured but recovered, that you'd been discharged and gone home. She paused, a shadow crossing her features. I wrote to you at the address they had on file. The letter came back marked "Return to Sender." I tried again a few months later with the same result. Eventually, I had to accept that maybe you didn't want to be found. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, pain that had nothing to do with her surgical site washing over her. I never received any letters. I was in the same house from the time I married Catherine until now. The address never changed. Diane's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of Catherine, but she didn't interrupt. There must have been some mistake in the records, Eleanor continued. Some bureaucratic error that... She trailed off, the magnitude of what they'd lost to such a mundane oversight overwhelming her. 32 years, she whispered, lost to a clerical error. Not entirely lost, Diane countered gently. We both lived those years, Ellie. Different lives than we might have had if we'd found each other sooner, but lives nonetheless. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the truth in this. What did you do after the hospital, after recovery? Went back to school, Diane said. Used the GI Bill to get my master's in nursing education. Taught at Vanderbilt for 20 years. Pride colored her voice. Specialized in trauma care training, using my experience to prepare a new generation of nurses for what they might face in combat zones. You achieved your dream, Eleanor said softly, remembering their late-night conversations in Iraq, the plans they'd shared under desert stars. One of them, Diane acknowledged. Never married, though. Came close once in the late 90s, but it didn't work out. She tilted her head, studying Eleanor. You mentioned Catherine? My wife, Eleanor confirmed. We were together for 40 years. She passed in 2011. Cancer. The familiar ache of that loss rose within her, now complicated by the knowledge that Catherine had known about Diane's survival. I'm sorry, Diane said, genuine compassion in her voice. 40 years is a lifetime. Not long enough, Eleanor replied, the simple truth of it hanging between them. A comfortable silence settled in the small office, both women absorbing the reality of their reunion, the weight of all that had been lost and perhaps improbably something now found. What happens now? Diane asked finally, her gaze returning to the dog tags that Eleanor still held. Eleanor opened her palm, looking down at the tarnished metal that had literally been part of her for so long. First, I return these to you. They're yours. Diane hesitated, then reached out with her left hand, fingers brushing against Eleanor's palm as she took the tags. The brief contact sent a jolt of recognition through Eleanor, the first time they had touched in 32 years. "Thank you," Diane said quietly, closing her fingers around the tags. "Though it seems strange to have them back after all this time." "I have something else to tell you," Eleanor said, gathering her courage. "Something I only discovered myself a few days ago." Diane waited, patient as Eleanor collected her thoughts. "Catherine knew you were alive," Eleanor said finally. "She found you somehow, after the war. She left me a letter before she died, telling me the truth, but I never found it until after the surgery." Diane's eyes widened, genuine shock registering in her expression. "Your wife knew about me? How?" "I don't know all the details yet," Eleanor admitted. "The letter was brief. She was very ill when she wrote it, but she said she'd found you years ago, that she'd wanted to tell me, but—" She shook her head. "I don't understand why she kept it from me." Diane considered this revelation, her analytical mind visibly working through the implications. "She must have had her reasons," she said finally. "Perhaps she thought she was protecting you." "From what? From knowing my friend was alive? From having the chance to apologize, to explain?" Bitterness edged Eleanor's voice. "From facing something you weren't ready to face," Diane suggested gently. "Trauma affects us in different ways, Ellie. Some people run toward it like I did, making it my life's work to prepare others for similar experiences. Others need to compartmentalize, to put it away somewhere they don't have to look at it every day." The insight struck Eleanor with uncomfortable precision. Hadn't she done exactly that? Tucked away her war experiences, her grief over Diane, focusing instead on building a life with Catherine, raising Jessica, constructing a carefully controlled existence where the past remained firmly in the past. "You might be right," she conceded reluctantly. "But she should have told me. I had a right to know." "Yes," Diane agreed. "You did. But we don't always do what we should, even with the best intentions." She glanced at the wall clock, then back to Eleanor. "There's so much more to say, so many years to account for. But perhaps not all at once, not today?" Eleanor nodded, suddenly aware of her own exhaustion. The long drive, the emotional impact of their reunion, the physical toll of recent surgery, all combined to leave her drained. "We're staying at a hotel tonight," she said. "Heading back to Massachusetts tomorrow." "So soon?" Disappointment flashed across Diane's features. "I need to be back for a follow-up appointment with my surgeon," Eleanor explained. "And Olivia has exams. Nathan's leave is short." "Of course," Diane nodded, understanding. "But perhaps this doesn't have to be another 30-year separation?" The question hung in the air between them, hopeful and tentative. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Not this time." She reached into her purse and withdrew a business card with her contact information. "All my numbers, my address." No clerical errors this time. Diane took the card, her fingers brushing Eleanor's once more. "I'd like that." She smiled, the expression transforming her face, momentarily revealing the young woman Eleanor had known in Iraq. "After all, I think we have quite a story to finish, you and I." As they rose to rejoin the others, Eleanor felt something shift within her. A realignment of past and present, a reframing of a narrative she'd told herself for 3 decades. The burden she had carried, both physical and emotional, hadn't been merely a manifestation of trauma and guilt. It had been, in some inexplicable way, a connection, a tether across time and distance to a friend she'd thought lost forever. "Ready?" Diane asked, holding the door. Eleanor nodded, stepping forward into a future suddenly richer with possibility than it had been just hours before. Ready. The drive back to the hotel passed in a blur of streetlights and quiet conversation. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat beside Jessica, her mind still in that small office with Diane, replaying their conversation, storing away details of the woman her friend had become. Olivia and Nathan followed in the second car, giving their grandmother space to process the emotional reunion. "Are you okay, Mom?" Jessica asked, glancing over as they stopped at a red light. Eleanor considered the question, its simple phrasing belying the complexity of what she felt. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "It's overwhelming." "She seemed nice," Jessica offered. "Kind." "She always was," Eleanor said softly. Even in the worst conditions, Diane had a way of finding humanity in the chaos. She stared out the window at the unfamiliar Nashville skyline. "I can't believe she's been alive all this time." "That I never knew." Jessica reached over to squeeze her mother's hand briefly before returning it to the steering wheel. "Mom knew," she said, voicing the elephant in the room. "She knew, and she didn't tell you." The light turned green and Jessica accelerated gently, mindful of her mother's recent surgery. "Yes," Eleanor said, the single syllable heavy with complicated emotions. "Your mother knew." They drove in silence for several blocks, both women lost in their own thoughts. "I found something else," Jessica finally said. "When you were in surgery, I was going through Mom's desk, looking for her medical power of attorney paperwork, and I found a box. A locked one." Eleanor turned to look at her daughter. "What kind of box?" "Metal. Small. The kind you'd keep important documents in." Jessica signaled for a turn, guiding the car into the hotel parking lot. "I found the key taped to the bottom of her jewelry box." "And?" Eleanor prompted, a strange tension gripping her. "Letters," Jessica said, pulling into a parking space and cutting the engine. "Dozens of them. Between Mom and Diane." Eleanor stared at her daughter, uncomprehending. "Between Catherine and Diane? What do you mean, between them?" Jessica met her gaze steadily. "They corresponded, Mom, for years. From what I could tell, it started around 1995 and continued until just before Mom died." The hotel room swam before Eleanor's eyes. She sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the small metal box open beside her, its contents spread across the floral bedspread. Letters, neatly bundled with faded ribbon. Photographs, news clippings about veteran recovery programs. And beneath it all, a sealed envelope with her name written in Catherine's elegant hand. "Why didn't you tell me about this earlier?" she asked, looking up at Jessica, who stood by the window, worry evident in her posture. "I wanted to, but then your surgery happened and we found the dog tags and everything was happening so fast." Jessica's hands twisted together anxiously. "And I wasn't sure. I needed to understand what it meant first, what Mom was doing." Eleanor picked up one of the bundles, untying the ribbon with trembling fingers. The topmost letter was dated June 1995, the paper yellowed with age. Catherine's familiar handwriting filled the page. "Dear Ms. Miller," it began formally. "You don't know me, but I am writing regarding my partner Eleanor Reynolds, who served with you in Iraq. I recently came across your name in an article about veteran rehabilitation programs at Walter Reed. Eleanor believes you died during a rocket attack in 1991. She carries tremendous guilt about your death." Eleanor's vision blurred, the words swimming together. She set the letter down, unable to continue. "There are more," Jessica said quietly. "So many more." "They span almost 16 years. 16 years, Eleanor echoed, the betrayal fresh and sharp. "She kept this from me for 16 years? "I don't think she saw it as betrayal," Jessica ventured carefully. "From what I've read, she was trying to understand what happened to you during the war. Diane provided insights that helped Mom support you through your nightmares, your depression. By going behind my back, By establishing a relationship with someone she knew I mourned without telling me that person was alive? Eleanor's voice rose, anger overriding her usual restraint. Mom was trying to help you, Jessica insisted. She wanted to protect you. From what? From knowing my friend hadn't died? From having the chance to apologize, to explain? The same question she'd posed to Diane now directed at her daughter, at Catherine by proxy. From yourself, Olivia interjected from the doorway where she and Nathan had been listening. Grandma, I've read some of those letters too. A great mom was afraid that learning the truth would destroy you, that your guilt over abandoning Diane would be replaced by guilt over not finding her sooner, not being there during her recovery. That wasn't her decision to make, Eleanor said fiercely. No, Nathan agreed, stepping into the room to sit beside his grandmother. It wasn't, but she made it out of love, not malice. Eleanor looked at her grandson, seeing in his young face an old soul's wisdom. When did you all get so damn insightful? She asked, a weak attempt at humor that nonetheless released some of the tension in the room. Must be those Reynolds genes, Nathan replied with a small smile. Eleanor returned her attention to the box, lifting out another bundle of letters, these in unfamiliar handwriting. Diane's, she presumed. The urge to read them warred with a sense that she was intruding on something private, something not meant for her eyes. What does it say? She asked, holding up the sealed envelope with her name on it. Catherine's letter to me? We don't know, Jessica said. It's still sealed. We wouldn't open that one. It was meant for you. Eleanor stared at the envelope, at her name in the handwriting of a woman 8 years dead. A woman who had been her partner, her confidant, her safe harbor for 4 decades. A woman who had kept a monumental secret from her throughout their marriage. I can't, she said suddenly, returning the envelope to the box. Not tonight. It's too much. Jessica nodded in understanding. There's no rush, Mom. Those letters have waited this long. Eleanor closed the box with a decisive click, the sound somehow final in the quiet hotel room. I need some air, she announced, rising carefully, mindful of her healing incision. I'll come with you, Olivia offered immediately. No, Eleanor shook her head. I need a few minutes alone. Just to the hotel courtyard and back, I promise. The night air held the crisp edge of early autumn, a welcome relief from the stuffy hotel room. Eleanor made her way to a wrought iron bench in the deserted courtyard, easing herself down with a sigh. Above her, stars punctuated the Nashville sky, the same stars that had shone over Iraq, over Massachusetts, over all the places where pieces of her story had unfolded. How had it come to this? Her entire understanding of the past 3 decades upended in the space of a week. The loss she had mourned revealed as a mistake. The wife she had adored exposed as someone who had kept life-altering information from her. The physical burden she had carried transformed from a symbol of guilt to something more complex. A literal connection to a woman she had believed lost forever. Eleanor touched the bandage beneath her blouse, the absence of the familiar weight still strange. For so long, that growth had been part of her identity, a secret she carried just as she'd carried the guilt over Diane's presumed death. Now both were gone, excised by surgical skill and unexpected truth, leaving her feeling strangely untethered. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. With a frown, Eleanor retrieved it, squinting at the unfamiliar number on the screen. Hello? She answered cautiously. Ellie? It's Diane. The voice that had once been as familiar as her own, now altered by time but still recognizable. I hope it's not too late to call. I got your number from the card you gave me. Eleanor's heart skipped. No, it's not too late. I'm just sitting outside getting some air. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation, Diane continued. There's so much more I wanted to say, to ask. I know, Eleanor agreed. It was overwhelming. That's one word for it, Diane said, a smile evident in her voice. Miraculous might be another. They fell silent, the miles between Eleanor's hotel bench and wherever Diane sat in Nashville seeming both vast and insignificant. Jessica found letters, Eleanor said abruptly, between you and Catherine. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if the connection had been lost. Ah, Diane finally responded, the single syllable heavy with understanding. I wondered if those might surface eventually. You knew she kept them. I kept mine too, Diane admitted. Everyone. They meant a lot to me, especially in those early years after the war. How did it start? Eleanor asked, the question that had been burning since Jessica revealed the box's contents. How did Catherine find you? Diane sighed, the sound carrying through the phone connection. It was 1995. I had just completed my master's degree and was featured in a small article in a nursing journal about veterans entering healthcare education. Catherine wrote to me out of the blue, said she'd seen my name and recognized it from your nightmares. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing Catherine coming across that article. The shock of recognition, the decision to reach out without telling her. She was trying to understand what had happened to you, Diane continued. What you'd been through that you couldn't or wouldn't talk about. She thought I might be able to give her some context. And did you? As much as I could, Diane said softly. I told her about our unit, about the conditions we worked in, about the attack that separated us. I didn't know the details of what happened to you after. I was unconscious for weeks, but I could fill in some of the blanks she was missing. And then? Eleanor prompted, needing to understand how an initial inquiry had transformed into a 16-year correspondence. And then we just kept writing, Diane said simply. At first it was all about you, Catherine sharing her concerns about your PTSD symptoms, me offering suggestions based on my work with other veterans, but over time it became more. She would share stories about Jessica growing up, about your construction business, about her psychology practice. I'd write about my students, my travels, my volunteer work. You became friends, Eleanor realized. The word inadequate for the relationship that had developed between her wife and the woman whose loss had shaped her adult life. Yes, Diane acknowledged. Friends who never met in person but who shared a deep connection through our love for you. The statement hung in the night air, both comforting and unsettling. Eleanor struggled to reconcile this new narrative with the life she thought she'd been living. A life where Catherine had been her sole confidant, where Diane had been a painful memory, where the two worlds had never intersected. She wanted to tell you, Diane said, breaking the silence. So many times over the years, her letters often mentioned her guilt about keeping my survival from you. But she was afraid. Afraid of what? Eleanor asked, though Olivia had already offered one answer to this question. Afraid it would re-traumatize you, Diane said gently. Afraid you'd blame yourself for not finding me sooner, for not being there during my recovery. Afraid you'd be angry with her for keeping the secret. And perhaps most of all, afraid that knowing I was alive would somehow disrupt the life you'd built together. That's ridiculous, Eleanor protested. Learning you survived wouldn't have changed my feelings for Catherine. Wouldn't it? Diane challenged softly. You and I were very close, Ellie. In those last months before the attack, especially. Eleanor's breath caught. They had been close, closer than mere colleagues, than ordinary friends. In the pressure cooker of war, their relationship had evolved into something intense and intimate, though never physically expressed. There had been an unspoken agreement that whatever was developing between them would be addressed after they returned home, and after that never came. She knew, Eleanor whispered, realization dawning. Catherine somehow knew what you meant to me. She did, Diane confirmed. I never told her explicitly, but she was a perceptive woman. She read between the lines of my stories, of my grief over losing touch with you. Eleanor sat with this revelation, piecing together a new understanding of her marriage. Had Catherine's decision to keep Diane's survival secret been motivated not just by a desire to protect Eleanor from additional trauma, but also by a fear of losing her to an old connection? I planned to tell you myself once Catherine passed, Diane continued, her voice gentle. She wrote to me when she received her terminal diagnosis. Asked me to wait a reasonable amount of time after she was gone, then reach out to you. But you didn't, Eleanor said, unable to keep the accusation from her tone. I tried, Diane countered. 6 months after her death, I sent a letter to your address, the one Catherine had always used. It came back marked, "Return to sender," just like my attempts after the war. That's impossible, Eleanor insisted. I never moved. I've been in the same house since 1973. I don't know what happened, Diane said, frustration evident in her voice. I tried again a year later with the same result. I even hired a private investigator at one point, but they couldn't locate you either. It was as if you'd disappeared. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to make sense of this information. She had been exactly where Diane and Catherine's letters should have found her all along. How could they have consistently failed to reach her? A memory surfaced, Jessica helping her sort through Catherine's things after the funeral, offering to handle the mail while Eleanor was lost in grief. Forward the important stuff, she told her daughter. I can't deal with it right now. Jessica, Eleanor breathed. She was managing my mail after Catherine died. She must have, but why would she? Ellie? Diane's voice held concern. What is it? I need to talk to my daughter, Eleanor said abruptly. Can I call you back tomorrow? Of course, Diane agreed, clearly confused by the sudden shift. Is everything all right? I don't know, Eleanor admitted, but I intend to find out. She ended the call and sat for a moment, gathering her strength for the confrontation ahead. If her suspicions were correct, Catherine wasn't the only one who had kept Diane from her. Her own daughter might have played a role as well. The hotel room fell silent as Eleanor finished speaking, her question hanging in the air between her and Jessica. Did you intercept letters from Diane after your mother died? Jessica's face drained of color, guilt written across her features more clearly than any confession. Mom, Yes or no? Eleanor cut her off, her voice steely. Yes, Jessica whispered, tears filling her eyes. But you have to understand. Understand what? Eleanor demanded, struggling to keep her voice level, aware of Olivia and Nathan watching this exchange with shocked expressions. That my own daughter decided to keep information from me, that you chose to continue your mother's deception? You were devastated after Mom died, Jessica said, words tumbling out in a rush of justification. You barely got out of bed for weeks. You weren't eating, weren't sleeping. The doctor had you on antidepressants that weren't even working. And then this letter arrives from a woman claiming to be someone you thought died in the war. I was afraid it would push you over the edge. That wasn't your decision to make, Eleanor said, the same words she'd used about Catherine, now directed at her daughter. I know that now, Jessica acknowledged, wiping at her tears. But at the time I was just trying to protect you like Mom always did. I found her letters to Diane when I was cleaning out her desk. I read enough to understand who she was, what she meant to you both. So you intercepted Diane's letters and what? Sent them back? Jessica nodded miserably. I marked them, "Return to sender." I thought it was a kindness, letting her know not to keep trying rather than just throwing them away. A kindness, Eleanor repeated, bitterness lacing her tone. Do you have any idea what you took from me? What both you and your mother took from me with your so-called protection? Mom, please, Jessica began. 32 years, Eleanor continued, her voice rising despite her effort to control it. 32 years of believing I failed her, of carrying that guilt. 32 years of nightmares, of avoiding anything that might trigger memories of Iraq. 32 years of physical pain from that damn growth because I was too stubborn, too afraid to have it checked. She stood, pacing the small hotel room despite the pull of her surgical incision. And all that time she was alive. All that time she was just a letter away, a phone call away. First Catherine kept her from me, and then you did. Both of you deciding what was best for me without ever asking what I wanted. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, genuine remorse in her tear-streaked face. "I was wrong. So wrong." The simple admission deflated some of Eleanor's anger, leaving behind a weary sadness. She sank back onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "I've lost so much time," she said quietly. "Time I can never get back." "But you have now," Olivia offered gently. "You found each other again. That has to count for something." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, at the earnest hope in her young face. "Yes," she acknowledged, "we found each other, no thanks to my family's interventions." The words hung in the air, sharp with accusation. "I'll make it right," Jessica promised, moving to kneel before her mother. "However I can, I'll make it right." Eleanor looked at her daughter, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. The anger that had flared so hotly began to cool, tempered by the recognition that Jessica's actions, however misguided, had sprung from love, just as Catherine's had. "I believe you," she said finally. "But right now, I need some space." Jessica nodded, rising to her feet. "Of course, we'll give you the room. Come on, kids." As Jessica ushered Olivia and Nathan toward the door, Eleanor called after them. "Wait." They turned, uncertainty in their postures. "I'm angry," Eleanor said plainly. "I have a right to be angry. But I still love you. All of you. I just need time to process this." Relief softened Jessica's features. "Take all the time you need. We'll be next door when you're ready." After they left, Eleanor sat in the silence of the hotel room, Catherine's sealed letter on the bedside table where she'd placed it earlier. She stared at it. This final communication from a woman she had loved deeply, but perhaps never fully known. With trembling fingers, she picked up the envelope and broke the seal. "My dearest Ellie," Catherine's familiar handwriting greeted her. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've finally discovered the truth I've kept from you for too many years." Eleanor settled back against the pillows, preparing herself for this posthumous conversation with her wife. "I found Diane in 1995 purely by chance. An article in a nursing journal caught my eye because you had called her name in your sleep the night before. When I realized she was alive, that the woman whose death had haunted you for years was teaching at Vanderbilt, I acted on impulse. I wrote to her, seeking insight into the trauma you couldn't speak about." Catherine's words flowed across the page, explaining how an initial inquiry had evolved into a friendship, how she'd justified keeping Diane's survival secret at first until it became too complicated to reveal without admitting to years of deception. "I told myself I was protecting you," the letter continued, "from further trauma, from guilt over not finding her sooner. But the truth, which I can admit now as I face my own mortality, is that I was also protecting myself. I was afraid, Ellie. Afraid of losing you to a woman who had shared experiences with you that I could never understand. Afraid that the connection you two had formed in the crucible of war might be stronger than what we had built over decades of civilian life." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring Catherine's elegant script. "I know now that my fear was unfounded. The love you've shown me throughout my illness has left no room for doubt about your commitment to our life together, which makes my deception all the more shameful. I've robbed you both of the chance to heal together, to understand what happened in Iraq, to move forward with full knowledge of the past. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, detailing Catherine's arrangements with Diane to contact Eleanor after a suitable period of mourning had passed. "She's promised to reach out 6 months after I'm gone. Please, when she does, try to forgive her for keeping my secret. The blame is entirely mine. And if you can find it in your heart, try to forgive me too. Not for my sake. It will be too late for that. But for your own." Now, you've carried the weight of unwarranted guilt for too long, my love. Don't add anger toward me to your burdens. The letter ended with a personal farewell that brought fresh tears to Eleanor's eyes, a reminder of the deep bond they had shared despite Catherine's deception. "All my love, now and always, Catherine." Eleanor set the letter down, emotions too complex to name washing through her. Anger at the betrayal, yes, but also understanding of the fear that had motivated it, grief for the years lost with Diane, but gratitude for the decades shared with Catherine. Sorrow for all of them. 3 women whose lives had been shaped by war and its aftermath in ways none could have predicted. She reached for her phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing Diane's number. "Ellie?" Diane answered on the second ring. "I didn't expect to hear from you tonight." "I read Catherine's letter," Eleanor said simply, "and I talked to Jessica. Turns out she intercepted your attempts to contact me after Catherine died." "Ah." Diane's voice held understanding rather than judgment. "The protective instinct runs in the family, it seems. Too damn strong for their own good," Eleanor agreed, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips despite everything. "I'm sorry," Diane said softly. "For all of it. For not trying harder to find you after the war. For agreeing to Catherine's request to keep her letters secret. For—" "Stop," Eleanor interrupted. "We've all made mistakes, all kept secrets we thought were protecting someone else. It ends now." "What do you mean?" "I mean no more secrets," Eleanor said firmly. "No more well-intentioned deceptions. Just truth, however complicated or painful. Can we agree to that?" "Absolutely," Diane replied without hesitation. "Truth from here on out." "Good," Eleanor said, a weight lifting from her chest. "Because I have a question for you and I need an honest answer." "Ask me anything," Diane promised. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering courage for the question she'd carried since their reunion earlier that day. "If things had been different, if we'd both made it home from Iraq, if we'd stayed in touch, what do you think would have happened between us?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if she'd overstepped, if she'd misinterpreted the connection they'd once shared. "I think," Diane finally said, her voice gentle but certain, "that we would have had to find out if what was growing between us in Iraq was real or just a product of extreme circumstances. And I think," she continued, her tone warming, "that it would have been real, Ellie. Very real indeed." The simple honesty of the answer brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the truth." "Always," Diane promised. From now on, always. As they continued talking into the night, Eleanor felt something shift within her. Not the sudden unburdening she'd experienced after surgery, but a more gradual realignment. The past she thought she knew was forever altered, the future suddenly less certain but somehow richer with possibility. The tragedy wasn't just what had happened in Iraq, she realized, or even the years of separation that followed. The real tragedy was how fear, Catherine's fear of losing her, Jessica's fear of her fragility, her own fear of confronting the past, had kept all of them imprisoned in half-truths and missed connections. But tragedy wasn't the end of their story. Not anymore. 6 weeks after surgery, Eleanor stood on her back porch watching autumn paint the Massachusetts landscape in shades of amber and crimson. Her surgical site had healed to a thin, white line, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. The physical absence of the growth that had been her companion for so long still occasionally startled her. Moments when she'd adjust her clothing unnecessarily or wake expecting the familiar pressure against her spine. Dr. Foster had pronounced her recovery remarkable for a woman of any age, let alone 60, during her last checkup. The nerve compression symptoms had resolved almost completely, though Eleanor still experienced occasional tingling in her right arm, a lingering reminder of what she'd carried for so long. "The human body is an amazing thing," Dr. Foster had said, reviewing Eleanor's latest scans. "Once we removed the source of irritation, your nerves began healing themselves. Some of that is thanks to Olivia's persistence in getting you to surgery before permanent damage occurred." Eleanor had nodded, acknowledging the debt she owed her granddaughter. Without Olivia's stubborn insistence, how much longer might she have carried that burden? How much more damage might have been done? The discovery of the dog tags had sparked considerable interest in the medical community. Dr. Foster had asked permission to document the case for a medical journal, preserving Eleanor and Diane's privacy while sharing the unprecedented biological response. "A living time capsule," one of the consulting specialists had called it, fascinated by how Eleanor's body had created a protective cyst around the foreign objects, preserving them for decades. Eleanor cared little for the medical curiosity her case represented. Her focus remained on the personal implications. The past rewritten, relationships reconfigured, secrets exposed to light after decades in darkness. The sound of a car on the gravel driveway pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, watching as a silver sedan parked beside her own vehicle. The driver's door opened, and Diane emerged, her movements graceful despite the absence of her right arm. She paused, taking in the old farmhouse with its wraparound porch and weathered clapboards, the maple trees ablaze with color, the gardens now fading into autumnal rest. Eleanor descended the porch steps, her heart quickening as it did each time she saw Diane. This ghost made flesh, this friend returned from a presumed grave. 6 weeks of regular phone calls, video chats, and emails had begun rebuilding their connection, but this was different. This was Diane in Massachusetts, Diane at her home, Diane stepping into the life Eleanor had built in her absence. "You found it," Eleanor called, crossing the yard to meet her visitor. "Your directions were perfect," Diane replied, smiling as she closed the distance between them. "Though I'm pretty sure my GPS would have gotten me here, too." "Can't trust those electronic gadgets," Eleanor said, falling easily into the teasing rhythm they'd rediscovered in recent weeks. "They'd have you driving through Thompson's cow pasture as a shortcut." They stood for a moment, suddenly awkward despite the ease of their long-distance conversations. Physical presence carried a weight that digital connection couldn't replicate, decades of aging made visible, the reality of Diane's missing arm impossible to ignore, the shared history and divergent paths embodied in their very presence. "Your home is beautiful," Diane said, breaking the momentary tension. "Just as you described it. Catherine chose it," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the house. "I was skeptical about a place so rural, but she had a vision for it. Turned out she was right, as usual." Diane's expression softened at the mention of Catherine. Their shared connection to Eleanor's late wife remained complex. Gratitude for Catherine's role in their eventual reunion mingled with lingering questions about her motivations for keeping them apart. "Come inside," Eleanor said. "I'll give you the tour before Jessica and the kids arrive for dinner. Fair warning, Olivia has prepared 1,000,000 questions about your prosthesis research. Apparently you're something of a celebrity in her biomedical engineering circles." Diane laughed, following Eleanor toward the house. "Hardly a celebrity. Just an old nurse who got tired of the limitations of standard prosthetics and started asking annoying questions at medical conferences." "Questions that led to 3 patents and a research foundation," Eleanor reminded her, holding the door. Don't downplay your accomplishments, Miller. I've Googled you, remember? Inside, the farmhouse revealed itself as a home well-loved and lived in. Comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than show, bookshelves overflowing with volumes ranging from medical texts to mystery novels, photographs chronicling a family's growth across decades. Diane moved slowly through the living room, studying the pictures with particular interest. Eleanor watched her friend take in the visual history of the life she'd built with Catherine, their wedding, Jessica's graduation, the twins as infants, family vacations, ordinary moments preserved in silver frames. "You were happy," Diane said softly, not a question but an observation. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, no hesitation in her voice. "Despite everything, the PTSD, the guilt I carried, the physical burden, we had a good life together. Catherine made sure of that." Diane nodded, still studying the photographs. "I'm glad," she said simply. "You deserved happiness, Ellie. Both of you did." The absence of bitterness in her tone struck Eleanor anew. Throughout their reconnection, Diane had shown remarkable grace regarding Catherine's deception, a forgiveness Eleanor herself was still working to fully embrace. "What about you?" Eleanor asked, the question that had hovered beneath many of their conversations finally spoken aloud. "Were you happy in the life you built without me?" Diane turned from the photographs, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. "Not at first," she admitted. "The early years were difficult. Learning to live with one arm, fighting for adequate veterans' benefits, nightmares about the attack." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Searching for you and finding nothing." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the shared experience of loss from opposite perspectives, one believing the other dead, one unable to find the other alive. "But eventually," Diane continued, "yes. I found purpose in teaching, in advocacy work for disabled veterans, in mentoring young nurses. I found joy in small things, my garden, good books, close friends." A small smile curved her lips. "And as strange as it sounds, I found a kind of connection through Catherine's letters. Knowing you were out there, living your life, even if I couldn't be part of it directly." The mention of the letters brought a familiar pang, the years lost to well-intentioned deception. Eleanor had spent hours reading the correspondence between Catherine and Diane since returning from Nashville, piecing together the relationship that had developed between the two women who had loved her in such different ways. "It's still hard for me to reconcile," Eleanor confessed, leading Diane toward the kitchen. "The Catherine I thought I knew with the woman who kept such a significant secret. She was protecting you," Diane said gently, the same explanation she'd offered before. "So everyone keeps telling me," Eleanor replied, a hint of the old bitterness surfacing. "Catherine, Jessica, hell, even you seem determined to defend her actions." "Not defend," Diane corrected, settling into a chair at the kitchen table while Eleanor busied herself with the coffee maker. "Understand, there's a difference." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the distinction. "Logically, I understand. Emotionally." She shrugged, letting the gesture complete her thought. "It takes time," Diane said simply. "God knows I've learned that lesson repeatedly over the years." They fell into comfortable silence as Eleanor prepared coffee, the domestic ritual somehow emphasizing both the strangeness and naturalness of Diane's presence in her home. When she finally joined Diane at the table, mugs in hand, Eleanor found herself studying her friend's face, the lines around her eyes, the silver hair cropped stylishly short, the scar above her left eyebrow that hadn't been there in Iraq. "What?" Diane asked, noticing the scrutiny. "Just thinking how strange this is," Eleanor admitted. "Having you here, in this house, in the life I built, believing you were gone." "Too strange?" Diane asked, a hint of vulnerability in the question. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Unexpected, surreal at moments, but not unwelcome. Relief softened Diane's features. Good, because I've been worried this visit might be too much, too soon. It's been 32 years, Eleanor reminded her dryly. I think we're well past too soon. Diane laughed, the sound warming the kitchen more effectively than any heater. Fair point, though in some ways it's only been 6 weeks, since the day you walked into that Veterans Center and turned my world upside down. The description resonated with Eleanor's own experience, the disorientation of discovering that a foundational belief about her past had been built on sand, the vertigo of realigning 3 decades of memories against a new truth. I've been meaning to ask you something, she said, circling back to a question that had nagged at her since their reunion. If Catherine hadn't intervened, if her letters had reached me after her death, if Jessica hadn't intercepted yours, what would you have said? What would you have wanted from me after all those years? Diane considered the question, her expression thoughtful. Honestly, I'm not sure. Closure, certainly. Understanding of what happened that day in Iraq from your perspective. Maybe forgiveness, though I've never blamed you for what happened. She paused, her gaze steady on Eleanor's face. And perhaps, if it seemed possible, a chance to know the woman you'd become, beyond the young nurse I remembered from the war. And now? Eleanor pressed. What do you want now, Diane? The directness of the question hung between them, charged with possibilities neither had fully articulated during their weeks of long-distance reconnection. Now, Diane said carefully, I want to know if the connection we once had, the one that was interrupted by war and miscommunication and well-meaning interference, still exists in some form. I want to discover who we are to each other in this chapter of our lives, without the pressure of combat or the weight of misunderstanding. She reached across the table with her left hand, palm upward in invitation. I want to find out if 2 women in their 60s, with all their accumulated scars and wisdom, might build something meaningful from the fragments of what they once were to each other. Eleanor looked at the offered hand, at the woman extending it, at the unexpected chance before her. Slowly she placed her own hand in Diane's, the simple contact sending a current of recognition through her, the first deliberate touch they had shared in decades. I want that too, she admitted, the words both terrifying and liberating in their honesty. Diane's fingers tightened around hers, warm and solid and real. Then we'll find out together. No rush, no pressure. Just truth between us from here forward. The sound of cars on the gravel driveway signaled Jessica's arrival with the twins, breaking the moment but not the connection. Eleanor squeezed Diane's hand once more before releasing it, rising to greet her family. They're going to love you, she assured Diane, who looked suddenly nervous at the prospect of meeting Eleanor's family properly. Olivia already thinks you're some kind of medical research goddess, and Nathan has been pestering me for war stories since he was 12. And Jessica? Diane asked, the unspoken complexity of that relationship hanging in the air. Eleanor sighed, acknowledging the challenge ahead. Jessica is working through things. She carries guilt about intercepting your letters, about continuing Catherine's deception without understanding the consequences. It wasn't malicious, Diane pointed out. She thought she was protecting you. The Reynolds women's favorite pastime, Eleanor said wryly. But she's trying. She suggested this dinner, actually. Wants to make amends in her own way. Before Diane could respond, the back door burst open, admitting Olivia in a flurry of energy and autumn leaves. Grandma, we brought pumpkin pie from Wilson's Bakery and oh! She stopped short, spotting Diane at the table. You must be Diane. I'm Olivia Reynolds. It's such an honor to meet you properly. Diane rose, accepting Olivia's enthusiastic handshake with good humor. The honor is mine. Your grandmother tells me you're heading for medical school with an interest in biomedical engineering. Very impressive. Olivia beamed, launching into questions about Diane's prosthetics research as Nathan and Jessica entered, arms laden with groceries and fall flowers. The kitchen quickly filled with voices, movement, and the comforting chaos of family. Eleanor watched as Diane integrated seamlessly into the dynamic, answering Olivia's technical questions with patience, sharing military stories that had Nathan captivated, engaging with Jessica in a conversation about nursing education that gradually eased the initial awkwardness between them. As they moved through dinner preparation together, Eleanor felt a strange doubling of her perception, seeing her family through Diane's eyes while simultaneously seeing Diane through theirs. The woman who had been a ghost, a regret, a burden carried within Eleanor's body for decades, was now flesh and blood at her kitchen table, laughing at Nathan's jokes, complimenting Jessica's cooking, debating medical ethics with Olivia. The conversation flowed easily through dinner, skimming across light topics before inevitably circling back to the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "I still can't believe Grandma's body preserved your dog tags for 32 years, Nathan said, helping himself to another slice of pie. "It's like something out of a movie." "Dr. Foster says it's not entirely unprecedented," Olivia corrected, always the medical authority. "There are documented cases of foreign bodies being encapsulated by cystic formations, but usually they're inert, not growing progressively larger over decades." "The body keeps the score," Diane said quietly, quoting the title of a well-known trauma study. "Sometimes literally, it seems." "Do you think," Jessica began hesitantly, "that Mom somehow knew about the dog tags, I mean? Is that why she was so insistent that you get the growth checked?" Eleanor considered the question, one she'd pondered herself since the surgery. "I don't think she knew exactly what was there," she said finally. "But Catherine had an intuitive understanding of how trauma manifests physically. She saw the correlation between my PTSD symptoms and the growth's development, even if she didn't know the specific connection." "The mind-body link is powerful," Diane agreed. "In my work with amputees, we see it constantly. Phantom limb pain triggered by emotional stress, recovery rates tied to psychological well-being. Like how Grandma's pain got worse when she'd talk about the war," Nathan observed, unexpectedly insightful. "I noticed that when I was younger." Eleanor looked at her grandson in surprise. "You did?" He nodded, suddenly self-conscious under the collective gaze. "You'd adjust your posture, rub your back. I thought it was just old person stuff. Sorry, Grandma." The table erupted in laughter, breaking the solemnity that had settled over them. Even Eleanor joined in, recognizing the simple truth in Nathan's observation. As the evening wound down, Jessica and the twins insisted on handling cleanup, shooing Eleanor and Diane onto the back porch with fresh coffee and strict instructions to relax. They settled into the old wooden swing that Catherine had installed decades ago, its gentle creaking a familiar soundtrack to Eleanor's evenings. "They're wonderful," Diane said, watching through the window as the three Reynolds worked together in the kitchen. "You've raised an amazing family, Ellie." "Catherine deserves most of the credit," Eleanor admitted. "She was the patient one, the emotionally available one. I was—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Carrying too many burdens to always be present," Diane finished for her, understanding in her voice. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, grateful for the insight. "Exactly that." They swung in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the maple trees, painting the sky in colors that reminded Eleanor of Iraqi deserts, though for once the association brought no pain, no reflexive flinch away from memory. "Tell me something," Diane said eventually. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, what would you change?" Eleanor considered the question, its implications rippling across the decades of her life. "Besides the obvious?" besides making sure I knew you were alive?" Diane nodded, waiting. "I would have talked about it," Eleanor said finally. "About Iraq, about you, about what happened that day. I would have let Catherine in fully, instead of walling off that part of myself." She sighed, watching her breath form a small cloud in the cooling evening air. "Maybe if I had, she wouldn't have felt the need to reach out to you secretly." "Maybe we all could have healed together instead of separately. And maybe not," Diane countered gently. "We'll never know what might have been, Ellie. We can only work with what is." "And what is that, exactly?" Eleanor asked, turning to face her friend directly. "What are we doing here, Diane? Two old women with more past than future, trying to make sense of a connection interrupted 3 decades ago?" Diane's expression remained steady, unintimidated by the challenging tone. "I think we're doing exactly what I said earlier. Finding out who we are to each other now, in this chapter of our lives. No expectations, no demands, just possibility." "Possibility," Eleanor repeated, testing the word and the concept behind it. After decades of certitude, the absolute belief that Diane was dead, that she had failed her friend, that her guilt was deserved, the openness of possibility felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "Too much?" Diane asked, reading her expression. "No," Eleanor said slowly. "Not too much. Just new. I've spent so long looking backward, carrying the past. The idea of looking forward instead is taking some adjustment." Diane smiled, understanding in her eyes. "We've got time," she said simply. "However much or little we have left, we've got it together now. No rush, remember?" Eleanor nodded, returning her attention to the sunset. The weight of Diane beside her on the swing, solid and real, anchored her in a present that felt more vivid, more immediate than any she'd experienced since Catherine's death, perhaps even before. Inside, she could hear Jessica and the twins laughing over some shared joke, the warm sounds of family drifting through the open window. Beyond the porch, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their separation, and now their reunion. For the first time in 32 years, Eleanor Reynolds felt the past receding, not forgotten, but finally taking its proper place in the context of a life still unfolding. The burden she had carried, both physically within her body and emotionally within her heart, had been excised, examined, and transformed. Not eliminated, for such things never truly disappear, but changed into something she could carry differently, something that might improbably become a bridge rather than a barrier to whatever time remained. "No rush," she agreed, her hand finding Diane's in the gathering darkness. "We've got time." 1 year after surgery, Eleanor stood before Catherine's grave in the small cemetery overlooking the Massachusetts countryside she had loved. The November air carried a crisp edge, rustling through the few stubborn leaves still clinging to the maple trees, Catherine's favorite season in all its fading glory. "Well, old girl," Eleanor said softly, placing a bouquet of late-blooming dahlias from her garden against the headstone. "It's been quite a year." The past 12 months had unfolded in ways Eleanor could never have anticipated. After that first visit, Diane had returned to Nashville to settle her affairs, then made increasingly frequent trips to Massachusetts. What began as weekend visits evolved into week-long stays, then 2-week stretches, until the inevitable question arose, why maintain 2 households when they spent most of their time together anyway? Diane had moved in 3 months ago, converting Catherine's old study into a combination office and therapy space, where she continued her prosthetics consulting work remotely. The transition had been remarkably smooth, their decades of independent living blending into a comfortable routine that honored both their individual needs and their growing connection. You should see the garden now. Eleanor continued her one-sided conversation with Catherine. Diane's expanded the herbs section, says my soil is perfect for medicinal plants. She started teaching workshops for veterans at the community center. Something about reconnecting with growing things being healing for PTSD. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, sending petals dancing across the granite marker. Eleanor smiled, choosing to see it as Catherine's response, her acknowledgement of how life had continued to evolve in her absence. Jessica's been promoted to head nurse in the surgical department, she added, knowing Catherine would want updates on their daughter. Says the hospital administration is actually listening to her ideas about improving post-op care, and Nathan finished basic training, looks so handsome in his uniform, tries not to show how scared he is about his first deployment. Reminds me of myself at that age, putting on a brave face. Eleanor paused, running her fingers along the cool granite of the headstone. Olivia started medical school this fall. Youngest in her class, of course. That girl never does anything by half measures. She's specializing in trauma medicine with a focus on veterans' care. Says what happened with me and Diane inspired her. The mention of Diane's name no longer brought the complicated surge of emotions it once had. The anger at Catherine's deception, the grief for lost years, the lingering questions about what might have been. Time and understanding had softened those reactions, leaving a more nuanced appreciation for the complex web of love and fear that had motivated Catherine's choices. I understand better now, Eleanor admitted quietly. Why you kept Diane from me. Not that I agree with it. I still think you should have trusted me with the truth. But I understand the fear behind it, the desire to protect what we had built together. She settled onto the small bench opposite the grave, grateful for its support as her joints protested the November chill. At 61, Eleanor had become more conscious of her body's limitations and more determined to work within them rather than ignore them as she once might have. The VA finally approved my disability claim, she continued, shifting to more practical matters. 32 years late, but who's counting? Diane says it's because the medical documentation from the surgery was irrefutable. Physical evidence of service-related injury that they couldn't dismiss. Between that and my pension, we're comfortable enough. Eleanor glanced at her watch, mindful of the time. Diane would be finishing her veterans workshop soon, and they had plans to meet for lunch at the small cafe in town that had become their favorite. I need to get going soon, she told Catherine. But there's something else you should know. She hesitated, gathering her thoughts. Diane and I have started something together, a support program for female veterans, especially those from our era whose service often went unrecognized and untreated. Pride colored Eleanor's voice as she described the project that had consumed much of their energy over the past 6 months. We call it carrying forward, a dual meaning. Acknowledging the burdens service women carry home from war, but also emphasizing the strength it takes to move forward with those experiences integrated rather than buried. The program had begun small, just Eleanor and Diane sharing their story with a handful of women at the local VA office. But word had spread, drawing participants from neighboring towns, then from across the state. The medical aspects of Eleanor's case, the physical manifestation of trauma, the body's preservation of Diane's dog tags, resonated deeply with women who had struggled to have their invisible wounds taken seriously. We're speaking at the National Women Veterans Conference next month, Eleanor said, still somewhat amazed by this development. Diane says our story gives people hope, that it's never too late for healing, for reconnection, for finding purpose in pain. She paused, reflecting on the transformation of the past year. The surgical scar on her back had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. The emotional scars had similarly diminished, not disappeared, but integrated into the landscape of her life in ways that no longer dominated her every thought, her every interaction. "I think you'd approve," she told Catherine Stone. "Not of how we got here. I know you carried guilt about that until the end, but of what we've created from it. Something healing, something meaningful." Eleanor rose from the bench, her hand resting briefly on the headstone in farewell. "I still miss you," she said simply. "That hasn't changed. I think about you every day. But it's different now. Less raw, more grateful. Grateful for the life we shared, for the family we created, for everything you taught me about love." As she walked back to her car, Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of melancholy and peace these cemetery visits always evoked. The grief of Catherine's absence remained, a constant companion she had learned to live with rather than fight against. But alongside it now existed a profound gratitude for Catherine's role in her life, and, ironically, in her reconnection with Diane, however circuitous the route had been. The drive home took Eleanor past landmarks that had witnessed her life's major chapters. The elementary school Jessica had attended, where Eleanor had reluctantly participated in mother-daughter events, always keeping emotional distance. The site of her first construction project after leaving nursing, now a thriving community center where, ironically, she and Diane sometimes held workshops. The small park where she'd scattered some of Catherine's ashes, fulfilling a request made in her final days. As she turned onto her street, Eleanor noticed Diane's adapted car already in the driveway, earlier than expected. The sight brought an involuntary smile to her face. Even after months of cohabitation, Diane's presence in her daily life remained a source of quiet joy, a continuing marvel. Inside, she found Diane in the kitchen, her one-handed cooking techniques honed to impressive efficiency as she prepared lunch. "Thought we were meeting at the cafe," Eleanor said, hanging her coat by the door. Diane turned, spatula in hand, her face lighting with a smile that still caused Eleanor's heart to skip. "Workshop ended early. Bobby had a doctor's appointment he'd forgotten about. Figured I'd surprise you with lunch here instead." She gestured toward the table, already set with Eleanor's favorite stoneware. "How was your visit with Catherine?" The easy acknowledgement of where she'd been, the comfortable inclusion of Catherine in their shared life, was one of the countless ways Diane demonstrated her remarkable grace. From the beginning, she had insisted that Catherine remain present in their home, in their conversations, in the foundation of whatever they built together. "Good," Eleanor said, moving to wash her hands at the sink. "Peaceful. Told her about the conference next month." Diane nodded, returning her attention to the stove. "I checked our flights this morning. Everything's confirmed." Eleanor watched her move about the kitchen, still sometimes struck by the simple miracle of Diane's presence in her home, in her daily life. The woman who had been a ghost, a regret, a physical burden carried within Eleanor's body for decades, now solid and real and making grilled cheese sandwiches with tomato soup. Catherine's favorite comfort food on chilly days, now adopted into their shared repertoire. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, taking plates from the cabinet to help, "about the presentation for the conference." "About how to explain what happened without sounding medically impossible?" Diane suggested with a small smile. "Spiritually overwrought? Psychologically implausible?" "All of the above," Eleanor agreed, grateful as always for Diane's ability to articulate her unformed thoughts. "It's such an unlikely story, even with the medical documentation." Diane turned off the burner, transferring perfectly golden sandwiches to the waiting plates. "Perhaps that's exactly the point," she said thoughtfully. "It's unlikeliness. The fact that against all medical probability, all statistical likelihood, your body preserved a piece of me until you were ready to face what happened." She carried the soup bowls to the table, setting them down with the practiced ease of someone who had adapted to performing two-handed tasks with one arm. "It gives people hope, Ellie." hope that their own buried traumas might someday emerge in ways that lead to healing rather than more pain. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in this assessment. Their story had indeed offered hope to the women in their support groups, women who had carried their own invisible burdens home from various conflicts, whose service and sacrifice often went unrecognized even by the systems designed to support veterans. Dr. Foster sent another email, she mentioned as they settled at the table. The medical journal article has been generating significant interest. She's been invited to present at 3 more conferences, and she wants us to join her for at least one. More public speaking, Diane sighed, though her eyes twinkled with good humor. You're turning us into celebrities in our old age, Reynolds. Hardly celebrities, Eleanor countered, echoing Diane's own words from months earlier. Just 2 old nurses with a story strange enough to make people listen. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the soup warming Eleanor after her time in the cemetery's chill. Through the kitchen window, she could see the garden they now tended together. Diane's medicinal herbs alongside Catherine's perennial flowers, a visual representation of how past and present had integrated in this home. Jessica called while you were out, Diane said eventually. The twins want to know if we'll host Thanksgiving again this year. Apparently, Nathan wants to bring someone, a fellow recruit he met during training. Of course we'll host, Eleanor replied. Though you'll have to handle the turkey. I still haven't mastered 1-oven timing for all those dishes. Between the 2 of us, we'll manage, Diane said with the quiet confidence that characterized her approach to most challenges. That's the beauty of partnership, isn't it? Complementary strengths. The simple observation carried weight beyond the context of holiday cooking. Over the past year, Eleanor had discovered the truth of this repeatedly, how her organizational skills balanced Diane's creative thinking, how Diane's openness with emotions complemented Eleanor's more reserved nature, how they had each developed different coping mechanisms for trauma that, when shared, expanded both their healing repertoires. Have I told you lately how grateful I am that you're here? Eleanor asked, the question emerging unbidden. Diane looked up from her soup, momentary surprise giving way to understanding. Visiting the cemetery always makes you reflective, she observed. And yes, you have. But I never tire of hearing it. She reached across the table with her left hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the months. Eleanor took it without hesitation, the simple contact grounding her in the present moment. I'm grateful too, you know, Diane continued, for the unexpected chance to know you again, for the welcome your family has extended to me, for the work we're doing together with the veterans groups. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging these shared blessings. It's strange, she said thoughtfully. If anyone had told me 2 years ago that the growth I'd carried for so long, the physical burden I resented and feared, would lead to all this, I'd have thought they were delusional. Life's like that sometimes, Diane replied. The very things we resist most stubbornly often contain unexpected gifts. Not that I'm romanticizing trauma, she added quickly. God knows we've both seen too much of its destructive power to do that. But transformation is possible, Eleanor finished for her, the phrase they often used in their veterans workshops. Even decades later. Even when it seems impossible. Their eyes met across the table, mutual understanding flowing between them. The recognition of 2 women who had journeyed through darkness, separately and now together, and emerged with hard-won wisdom to share. After lunch, they moved to the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for conversation, wrapped in sweaters against the November chill. The property stretched before them, trees nearly bare now, the distant hills visible through branches that in summer formed a green canopy. I've been thinking about something else, Eleanor said, as they settled into the gentle rhythm of the swing. Something I'd like your honest opinion on. Always, Diane promised, her expression attentive. I want to write it all down, Eleanor explained. Our story. Not just the medical aspects that Dr. Foster documented, but everything. Iraq, the years of separation, Catherine's role, the reunion, all of it. Diane considered this thoughtfully. For publication, you mean? Or for your family? Maybe both, eventually, but primarily for other women veterans, as an extension of our work with the support groups. Eleanor hesitated, then added, "If you're comfortable with it. It's your story too, after all." "Our story," Diane corrected gently. "And yes, I'd be comfortable with that. More than comfortable. I think it's an excellent idea." Relief washed through Eleanor. She'd been considering this project for weeks but had hesitated to suggest it, aware of how much vulnerability it would require from them both. "It won't be easy," Diane cautioned, "revisiting some of those memories, committing them to paper." "I know," Eleanor acknowledged, "but I think it's important. So many women from our era served without recognition, came home with wounds both visible and invisible, struggled to reintegrate into civilian life with little support. If our experience helps even a few of them feel less alone." She didn't need to complete the thought. This shared mission had become central to their life together, using their own unlikely journey toward healing to illuminate paths for others. "Where would you begin?" Diane asked, practical as always. Eleanor considered the question, the natural storyteller in her awakening to the challenge. "With the surgery, I think. The moment Dr. Foster discovered your dog tags inside me, the physical revelation that led to everything else unfolding." Diane nodded approvingly. "Start with the most dramatic moment. Good narrative strategy." "I learned from the best," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "You were always the one who could keep wounded soldiers calm with your stories during transport. Remember that sergeant with the chest wound, how you talked about fishing in Montana for the entire helicopter ride?" "Johnson," Diane supplied immediately. "Robert Johnson from Billings. I ran into him at a veterans event in 2010. 3 kids, successful construction business, still fishes whenever he can." The easy recall of a patient from decades ago didn't surprise Eleanor. Both women carried such memories, names, faces, injuries, outcomes both good and tragic. It was part of what bonded them, this shared catalog of lives intersected during their military service. "We could work on it together," Diane suggested. "Alternate perspectives, fill in each other's blanks." "I'd like that," Eleanor agreed. The collaborative approach appealed to her, a way to weave their separate experiences into a complete narrative, much as they had woven their separate lives into a shared one over the past year. As afternoon faded toward evening, they remained on the porch, wrapped in blankets now against the deepening chill, making preliminary notes for the writing project. The familiar contentment of their shared routine enveloped Eleanor. The easy exchange of ideas, the comfortable silences, the knowledge that whatever challenges arose, they would face them together. This, she reflected, was perhaps the most unexpected gift of all. Not just the removal of a physical burden she'd carried for decades, not just the resolution of guilt and grief long misplaced, but the discovery that at 61 life still held possibilities for new beginnings, for connections renewed and deepened, for purpose found in sharing hard-won wisdom. The woman who had emerged from surgery a year ago bore little resemblance to the one who had reluctantly entered the hospital, driven by her family's intervention. The physical transformation was obvious, the absence of the growth that had caused increasing pain, the improved mobility, the healthier color in her face now that chronic discomfort no longer drained her energy. But the emotional and spiritual changes ran deeper still. The burden Eleanor had carried, both within her body and within her heart, had not simply vanished. It had been examined, understood, and ultimately transformed into something that served rather than hindered her remaining years. As darkness settled over the Massachusetts countryside, Eleanor Reynolds looked at the woman beside her. This friend, returned from a presumed grave, this partner in healing work, this unexpected gift of her later years, and felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for decades. Not the completion of an ending, but of a circle long broken, now finally whole. Catherine remained an essential part of that circle, her presence in Eleanor's life undiminished by death or by the new relationship that had formed in her absence. The love Eleanor had shared with her wife of 40 years existed alongside the renewed connection with Diane, different in nature, in expression, in context, but equally valid, equally precious. "What are you thinking about?" Diane asked softly, noticing Eleanor's contemplative silence. Eleanor smiled, squeezing Diane's hand where it rested between them on the swing. "About circles," she replied. "About how sometimes the most crooked path still leads us where we need to be." Diane nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation, one of the countless gifts of their connection. "Not where we expected to be," she said, "but exactly where we should be." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The same stars had shone over Iraq during their military service, over the decades of separation, over the improbable reunion that had led them here, to this porch, to this moment of quiet contentment. The future stretched before them, uncertain in its details but secure in its foundation. Whatever time remained, months, years, decades, if they were fortunate, they would face it together, carrying forward not just their own healing, but the possibility of healing for others who had walked similar paths. "Ready to go in?" Diane asked as the temperature continued to drop. "I think we've outlined enough for one day." Eleanor nodded, gathering their notes and blankets. As they rose from the swing, she cast one final glance at the night sky, at the property that had witnessed so much of her life's journey, at the woman beside her, who had been lost and found against all odds. "Ready," she said simply, and together they stepped through the doorway into warmth and light. Have you ever carried a burden so long you couldn't imagine life without its weight? Eleanor's journey from pain to healing speaks to all of us who've weathered life's unexpected storms. At 60, she thought her story was written, a widow carrying physical and emotional scars from a war long past. But when surgeons discovered her friend's dog tags preserved inside her for 32 years, Eleanor was given a second chance most of us only dream about. Her remarkable reunion with Diane reminds us that it's never too late for healing, for connection, for finding purpose in our pain. The burdens we carry, grief, regret, misunderstanding, can sometimes become bridges to our most meaningful chapters. Whether you're facing retirement, empty nests, health challenges, or the loss of someone dear, remember Eleanor's discovery. The heaviest burdens are those we carry alone. What burden might you be ready to set down? What relationship in your life deserves a second chance, even after decades of silence? Share your story in the comments. We find healing not just in telling our own stories, but in witnessing each other's journeys toward wholeness. It's never too late for a new beginning.